The Saucetown Saga by J.W.E. Scott. Chapter 1. Towels in the Rain. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I've watched sea beams glitter in the dark at the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like towels in the rain. Dolph Lundgren, Blade Trinity. So my local theater had a kind of competition for the whole of Columbus, Ohio, but mostly just for all the students who went there all the time. What they decided to do was host one of their screening rooms to just play Groundhog Day over and over again for 24 hours, lunchtime to lunchtime. The prize for sitting through the whole thing was a year pass to the cinema for free. A simple equation. Sit in the cinema for 24 hours, bring some food with you or buy some at the counter outside the screening room, use the bathroom from time to time, and you could get a year pass to the theater whenever you'd want. The beauty, of course, is that you never want to go back to the cinema ever again after that experience. But anyway, me and some friends went and we stayed the whole time. They gave us these bands to go around our arms and we couldn't take them off or leave the cinema during any of the 24 hours. Outside the screening room, they had a little stall with salty food and a single bathroom, and we stayed in that little place the whole time. How was it? I asked. Oh, it was god-awful. Never again. But I won! The important thing is that I won. By the third or fourth time, it didn't even matter anymore. The whole theater was just mimicking and talking along with the film through each line. Even the bits where he learns piano, everyone was singing the notes along with it. 24 hours and I got a free pass to go back to the cinema for a whole year. Did you use it? Once or twice. I woke up to the sound of heavy drilling. I found from my watch that it was 7 a.m. Time to get up. This was a regular occurrence in Kontorsgatan, the wonderful ghetto neighborhood of Uppsala, Sweden. When my friend originally helped me pack and move into the flat, he told me his dad had lived there in the 1980s, and to quote, "It was a shithole then too." It was a regular occurrence to hear drilling at 7 a.m. because of various contractual obligations which we had signed as international students moving into the complex. For example, with building works going on, we had no silly legal rights to ask for reduced rent, somewhere else to live, or in fact anything from the building company. They were perfectly within their right to commit building work within our corridor at 7 a.m, mostly the aforementioned heavy drilling and the removal of various parts of the floor. I put my shoes on to go out into the communal corridor and found the whole place full of a thick black soot that was hanging in the air. Coming out of the stale overnight air from my bedroom, I covered my mouth and ran past the 3 builders working, who ignored me, and rushed into the communal kitchen. There were tools and equipment lying everywhere, and I decided against carrying my breakfast back through the corridor. I ate crunchy naturel, that was my little Swedish heaven, saying me on more occasions than I can count. Looking through the cupboard, I saw that I was running out of my beloved British tea, and I knew that there wouldn't be any more coming after I had run out. But that didn't matter anymore, because I remembered there and then, at 7 a.m, what today was going to be about. Today we were going to Saucetown. The builders finally left, and I decided to have a shower. I went back through to my room, got my stuff, and returned to the corridor where the shared shower was placed. As I was midway through, I heard the builders return. This apartment block had absolutely no noise cancellation through any of its doors, not least the shower. Over the sound of running water, therefore, came back the incessant drilling and chewed rambling of the builders. Was there no depth Reek's hymn would sink to? I left the shower with my towel wrapped around my waist and stepped into another cloud of thick black soot. I felt all of my clean skin immediately soaked in a sticky, filthy mist that I daren't breathe in. This had unfortunately become a regular occurrence since the previous October, and I resigned myself, after many legal arguments, into surviving until the end of the year in Elvis Presley's ghetto. This was my Uppsala life, but for 3 days it wasn't to be my life anymore. I got myself ready with my bag on my back, along with 3 layers of clothes and some serious enthusiasm to get past those builders and outside into the fresh cold air. Although I disliked the slush, I have always been in love with the winter months. Most of my favorite memories as a child were of sledging down the hills nearby our old home in Scotland. Warm climates have always killed me, and I melt rather than burn. I was nearing St. Olavsgatan and the many bridges that crossed Fyrisån, and saw the river had again frozen over. I took this route deliberately, though it was a little out of my way, just so that I could walk over these picturesque bridges the way so many people must have been doing for centuries. Uppsala filled one with a feeling of community. There was a rich history to the place, ever present in the architecture and atmosphere, though always understated by its people. The Swedes I met were always modest, and always keen to talk themselves in their place down, but it was the quiet mornings walking over the frozen Fyris that told me life was good here. I was headed for Stockens, one of the biggest of the Uppsala student unions, and one of my least favorite. What it did hold in its favor, however, was very good lunches for a relatively cheap price. 50 big ones could get you a rather large, well-cooked meal, backed up with unlimited tea, coffee, bread, and gingerbread. This bargain had been long pounced upon by our family, and the Sauce boys had all agreed that this would be the perfect place to meet to sustain ourselves before the oncoming journey. I was dog-tired by the time that I arrived at Stockens. It was something like half an hour to walk from my accommodation, and though that in itself was not long, the snow always adds extra weight, and the cold makes you use more energy just to move in a forward direction. The flag of the Union that hangs over the Uppsala's main boulevard was absolutely sopping wet, and was directing an aggressive cold wet drip of water down on the unsuspecting locals. Dodging it, I walked through the small gate beside the building and around the back to the entrance. As usual, there were the posh gits smoking cigarettes, perhaps the only people in Sweden who could even afford cigarettes, and the various other types who hung around there all the time without any real purpose. Walking around them, I strode up the stairs, past the small rooms, and into the grand hall that was the Union's food court. Our 2 Americans, Tom and Jackson, had arrived before me and were already consuming gratuitous amounts of coffee and gingerbread, perhaps in preparation. The real quality of Stockens was the gratuity, and the key to it all was taking advantage of every piece of charity these Swedes would give us. Whether one had paid or not, the hungry student, or indeed anyone, could eat a near banquet and never even get noticed amongst the grandeur and excess of that place. We stocked up and started talking. Jackson explained that Axel and Katja would meet us at Systembolaget and the tube station respectively. We were going to pass by Systembolaget anyway before we got on our way. Booze was necessary when preparing for 7 hours of traveling. Jackson looked at the rest of us and remarked, "The Lord is coming with fire." Tom, next to me, looked across the table and replied slowly, "Geez, oh man." This was a regular turn of phrase by this point in our friendship, and I did not even look up for my free-breaded Earl Grey. I eventually said, "You guys know who Earl Grey was?" "Of course," said Tom, "the great colonial tea drinker. You Brits' greatest celebrities are those who drank an inhuman amount of the milky beans and got made earls for it." Apparently he was the guy who officially ended slavery in Britain and the Empire. No, everyone knows that Mel Gibson ended slavery. And that was that. Back to eating. There was a collective silence for a minute or two whilst we contemplated what we were brewing up for Saucetown. Staring down at my unfinished third free cup of tea, Tom asked me, "Have you had enough of your milky beans?" I nodded. It's honestly a waste of a good bean. It's not good for you to go to lunch without milking down your beans. Jackson started to talk. "Well, I've heard from Axel, Henry, and other folks that apparently the folks in Saucetown are super nice. Apparently it's really chill and everyone there is full of hygge. Everyone says that it's really warm and cozy there, so we might even make some friends." Tom said, "Wow." I had a 2-week dream. It was now 12 p.m. Jackson asked me if I wanted more bread, and I graciously accepted on the grounds that I always took a delight in any free product or service, preferably food. Something in my Scottish blood, I believe. We all kept eating in grave preparation for the long, dark road that awaited us. Time was slowly ticking onward, and before we were to meet Axel and Katja, we had to see an old friend. Before the stairs flowed down to the ground floor, there lay before the good people of Stockens a tray for empty cups and plates. Our eyes moved rightwards towards the aforementioned gratuities, laid out together on a grand set of silver and polish. Gingerbread, tea bags, fresh loaves just off the tube from Gastown. Zipping open the secret pockets in my coat, I proceeded to shovel in a few slices here, a few biscuits there, while Tom and Jackson covered my back with crass remarks about John Kasich's nuts. This used to make me feel guilty. Tom had pulled me out of that way of thinking, however, with a hefty bellow. As a wise man once said, Fuck 'em. A group of young men and women walked past in suits like we were invisible. Physically shaking, Jackson remarked, "This is just nuts." "I told you so." As we shuffled down the stairs like bloodhounds, I could only mutter, "Geez, oh man." Returning to the great front door, we all simultaneously decided that we needed to use the bathroom. Not knowing of the location of the facilities, we decided to split up in a coalition effort to find them. Tom and I, American and Brit united in their greatest escapade since when our leaders shared that golf buggy that one time, I found the gentleman's room, whilst Jackson found the ladies at the opposite door. Upon walking into the wrong bathroom, he proceeded to shout, "Free for all!" And I guess we really didn't know just how right he would be. How free and how all, nobody at the time knew. Tom and I knew better than to delve deeper, so we waited outside of the front door for the free-for-all to end. Deciding never to speak of what had just occurred, Jackson met us at the entrance, and we went to meet Axel. Shuffling down the boulevard on a slushy cold sun-drenched lunchtime in March, we crossed the Firis in a state of contentment for the future. There was something unmistakable in my mind, that this weekend was going to be special. The way a child is filled with calming ecstasy on Christmas morning, I knew that I would soon be in the fabled Saucetown, and there was no other place I would rather be. In the main square, Jackson dropped his wallet. "Droppin' Jackson!" Tom shouted. Jackson dropped things. We walked and talked. Systembolaget had a good few customers on a Friday lunchtime, with the usual tramps stalling at the checkout while the rest of us sensible folks just wanted to get pissed on public transport. We had to fight for our position in getting on the Lonkis and the Obros and the kind of red wine that comes in a card carton and only costs 50 big ones. No questions asked from the man at the counter as he pulls the snus out of his mouth and puts it on a little dentist tray in front of him. My man did just that before reaching into his shirt pocket, pulling out another dry pouch and shoving it up into his gums. He had a fine little collection, did that man. A veritable set of soldiers ready to cancerify his mouth and leave him with black gums, like the gums you see on 5-year-old kids when their parents rub sugar on the insides of their mouths so that the baby teeth come out quick. I had 2 Obros and 3 Lonkis. I wasn't going too overboard on an afternoon tube. Jackson was well stocked himself, while Tom had come all this way and bought bugger all. At this he merely prodded his own temple and said, "Don't worry, Claxon's blaring." He was right. The music in this place was completely off. The dissonance all of a sudden became unbearable, and I couldn't focus my eyes on anything. Probably just my thyroid, I thought. "You doing all right there, buddy? Have you got a case of the Shimas, if you know what I'm saying?" "I'm fine, dude. Jesus, is that Bob fucking Dylan they're playing?" "No, dude, it's the Beatles. Bob doesn't play nearly as bad as that." "You know he got offered that award by the Nobel people?" "Did he accept it?" "Who cares?" "Who in the Beatles ever played the harmonica?" "Whichever one was the CIA plant." Axel turned up to save my thyroid with a couple of culpa bags and some words from the big guy. "You can call me Mr. Moonlight, baby." Axel had mousy hair, more on the blonde side, still holding on to some of that baby fat on his cheeks. He had on a woolly jumper and a big black coat with one of those faux Harry Potter scarves that attracted the ladies. His bag was very small, but apparently had everything to hold him for the weekend. In his hands were an apple and an open packet of cheese. He took alternate bites from each as he talked to us. "Let's get the Obro and get out!" We did. Just around the corner from the booze dispenser was the station. We had plenty of time and so thought we might laze around George's cafe and get us something to eat before we were off. From his place we could see our platform and everything. We got ourselves a little table out of the way, not even in the cafe, and pulled out some Lonkis. Some youths were hanging out by the station entrance as usual and making the whole area look bad. Axel was about to get up and order something when some waiter we didn't recognize told us to get lost. We demanded to see George, but that got us nowhere. "Get George out here," we demanded. Our innocence shattered, we threw a few slurs straight out of the whorehouses of Gastown at not George. George would turn in his grave if he were to see this. Jackson even offered to go into the cafe and buy something, but it seemed a bit too late for that at this point. So like nomads on laxative, we got up again and headed outside. I looked at my watch. Bloody hell, 20 minutes. We were the ADD generation, and I wasn't going to be standing around for that long. I rolled up my sleeves and started heading for George's. These chains of gloves had a hold on me. Yeah, but then Katya apparitioned down to the ground right there in front of me. A fire circle burst open from the floor, and up she floated in a second. "Hey, Ray! Where's Metropolis, eh?" I turned up the corners of my mouth into something that a scientist would call a smile. "Katya! Yes! Nice you're here. Let's get going, shall we?" Katya was mousy-haired, much like Axel, though hers was long and straight and she kept it tucked underneath all her various items. Right now she had on a Moomy hat and a coat that went down to her shoes. Even in person, she seemed almost animated in a way. Now we were all at the platform chatting for a bit. The tube was coming in, let's say 5 minutes. How about a picture, someone asked. It was now or never. The 5 of us stood in all our late winter gear, and everybody wanted to be in the picture. We saw a gentleman standing on his own, so we approached him. "A.k.a., etc." We asked him for a picture, and he sort of shuffled away from us on the platform. His eyes remained coldly fixed on that 4 minutes on the timer, and every time one of us moved closer, he moved back. I had played the game of Jensen versus 2 Bens before, and so I was determined to get this picture. Axel beat us to it, and a.k.a. made the hell out of that guy. He was forced by that damn beautiful face to accept the favor and take our bloody picture. So it was. Us 5 standing there, the future sons of Saucetown, freers of the city-state, posed arm in arm by the station platform, waiting for Blåtåget to take us there. The man lowered his furry gray eyebrows at us, returned Axel's camera, and walked far away from us down the other side of the platform where we couldn't scare him anymore. Tom opened up his hip flask he had kept under his trousers. Was it Tom or Jackson who didn't wear underwear? I couldn't remember, but Tom offered me some of his gin and tonkus in a flask, and how could I refuse? So I took a big chug and got an immediate bout of the shimas. My shimas were hurting mad sore, and I was going to need to evacuate pretty quickly. I was in luck because the tube came right there and then, if incredibly slowly. For a blue tube, it was more yellow than it was blue, but at this point I forgave it for I desperately needed to use their facilities. After a million years, the silent tube let out a great sigh and stopped at Uppsala Station, Platform 1. The air was crisp and bit a little inside my jacket and trousers. The snow had gone, but the cold remained. We all got inside our carriage and found our seats. That is, everyone except me, who emptied my shimas. I remember hearing a rule that you weren't supposed to flush when the tube was stopped at a station, but a flash fire of the G13 had me saying, "Damn that rule." So I flushed and went back to find my seat. Tom, Jackson, and Axel had found our seats. A nice cozy table with space enough for me. I sat down next to Tom, who was still taking his medicine. It occurred to me that Katya was not amongst us. Without saying a word, she had found her seat and sat down, at least half the carriage away from the rest of us. The tube was empty and she could easily have sat on any surrounding chair, as they were all empty, but she waved a little wave and smiled, and tried not to look at us. Tom screamed with laughter at a joke he'd just remembered, and the tube left at its scheduled time of 2:20 p.m. Jackson offered me some pear water. I politely declined, opened up my journal, and started writing. I had to clear my head after all that mincemeat.
Chapter 2. GRUNK Night. It was the logical conclusion of the free-thinking, free-roaming Erasmus generation, and its like will never be seen again. I could go on at length about the different kinds of people you meet abroad on exchange. Very shortly after arriving in Sweden, I realized how lonely I was going to feel in a new country. There were so many people, girls mostly, who used their time abroad to fill their social media accounts with pictures of themselves next to famous monuments and mountains. People came from all sorts of backgrounds, but there was a clearly defined group, even from my native Britain, who were clearly in money and used their time abroad as something of a vanity project. It was really difficult to wrap my kid head around. I found the right people in the end, however. From the first, when I spent a year at Uppsala, I made a staunch effort to have myself enrolled in the intensive Swedish course at the university. When I moved there, I wanted to immerse myself. I wanted to really be in Sweden, to speak and to live just like the locals, and to reinvent myself after the unhappy life I lived in Scotland. It was one of my finest choices, as I met 2 of the principal characters of this story on the very first day of intensive Swedish, Tom and Jackson. They were both Americans, one East Coast, the other West Coast, one a Hillary Sanders supporter, the other a Trump supporter. It was just the kind of microcosm that good friendships spring from. Among the many friends I made on that first week in intensive Swedish, Tom and Jackson stayed with me through thick and thin, and even through Saucetown. Every morning it got us up early, sitting in language classes. I've always loved learning languages. And spending our afternoons in cafes or seeing sights. It got us close, us travelers in a foreign land, desperately trying to find companionship in a lonely country. Maybe that's romantic, but that's the way it was. When you live abroad, you have to take the initiative, or you'll end up very lonely. My first semester of our time in Uppsala was somewhat chaotic. I had recently broken up with my girlfriend, and in the space of a few months had encountered a few difficult situations with the other sex. My Swedish was improving, and the university courses were very hit and miss. But mostly, I was just bored. I had too much spare time, as did many of the folks in our group. We were young and certainly reckless, and we quickly learned that if we didn't take action, we were going to waste our year abroad. Time was running out, and Christmas was upon us in no time. So, although it was difficult to begin with, and the days were interminably long, I ended up developing a comfort zone. I had never lived abroad before, never mind outside of my hometown. In the first few weeks I genuinely thought I had made a massive mistake. Although we had made a strong friend group in the first few weeks of Uppsala, and many of the members were very close-knit and loyal, it was true that fringe members of our family were moving on to different crowds, and simply didn't want to hang out with us anymore. It was a gradual change, but one we were entirely conscious of. As the semester continued, we all found ourselves increasingly isolated, and increasingly in need of some kind of outlet or place to spend our time. Our solution was very simple in the end: clubs and societies. And whilst that may not seem like such a punchline or a eureka moment to make a song and dance about, it was in the end how we met Axel. We ended up becoming friends with Axel through the Kalmar Union on Monday evenings. At the mixtape circle, we would pick a theme, and each play a song to the rest of the group that would fit that theme. It was a cozy way to spend a weekday evening, a good way to listen to music, and a great excuse to visit the pub afterward. By the time Axel was roped into our friend group, we had already developed into the baseless animals that would invade Saucetown in only a few months' time. Axel was the youngest of us, and maybe the most naive. Although he was carefree and enjoyed a good laugh, I don't think he could have prepared himself for what we put him through. My first memory where all the Sauce boys were together was in the December of 2016. It was a standard night of Mixtape Circle, and we went down to the Union pub for some quiet drinks. Very soon we had a lock-in and were wandering around the student house, filming our own homemade remake of The Lord of the Rings. It was at this point we accepted Axel into our friend group, and when we realized this was going to be the beginning of something special. Axel had his own groups to see as well, and, though he would hang out on occasion, it was often occasions and not on a regular occurrence. Christmas came about, we went our separate ways for the holidays, and after a long break we returned to Uppsala as new people. In my time abroad I had built my new life, and had become the new person I didn't know I could be. Returning to Uppsala for another 5 months was the greatest thing I could ever have looked forward to, and we took every opportunity handed to us. This was how GRUNK Night came about. This next story starts on the day of U.S. President Donald Trump's inauguration, only a few months before our fateful weekend. We were sitting in Hugo's cafe with Hugo himself and deciding the best method to invade Brunk Night by. Brunk Night? I asked. I swear it was called GRUNK Night. I'm going to be performing in it, Angus chattered, a bead of sweat dripping down the side of her head and conveniently avoiding all her facial features. She sat next to the main radiator that covered half of the back wall, which raised the room temperature long past bearable. The front window that faced the street showed the heavy snowfall covering the cars and the passers-by, all eager for shelter from the biting cold. The hour was getting late on Friday night, and the cafe was closing soon. I think I know the name. Jackson, fiddling with his phone, brought up a live-streamed video, full volume in the cafe, as Mr. Trump was midway through swearing his oaths. We awkwardly laughed the way one does when they live in interesting times. Hugo started to cry, so Tom picked him up and took him back to his dad. The proprietor spoke to Tom for a little while, presumably about hummus, and when Tom returned, we made a plan. GRUNK Night was one of the most special nights of the year for the students of Uppsala University. Limited ticky availability, live music, affordable drinks, and all 12 student union jazz bands performing live, back to back. It had taken us too long to buy tickies, and so we couldn't legally attend. That wouldn't stop Jackson, Tom, and Ray. We had made a promise to Angus and Sophangus that we would see them perform, and we were getting into GRUNK Night even if it got us deported, which, let's face it, would have been pretty funny. Vedala, proud hosts of the event, had been closed down for a few years in the 1980s for having an above-saturated capacity event where almost everybody was in possession of alcohol that had been smuggled into the venue. It was now our plan, no, our mission, to close down Väståla once again and have our place in the university's history solidified forever. Linnaeus, Celsius, Bergman, Bellman, these names meant nothing now, for they were to be forgotten as footnotes in our wake. We reconvened in Kalmar, across the road from Väståla, on Saturday night as was our custom. Tom, Jackson, and I were there in the downstairs pub known as the Ordering Hole, buying our first round of drinks. We had unknowingly stumbled into board game night, and I was given the responsibility of choosing the game. Almost immediately on the end of the bar, under many famous and respected titles, I saw the one game we were destined to play that night. It was a knockoff Harry Potter board game, done in that early fantasy art style before the movies had come out, and was entirely in Finnish. My Finnish at this time was limited mostly to Kukkakaali and Kekkonen, but we decided to give it a shot anyway. After an hour and 3 beers into an intense competition of throwing dice and moving counters up rotating staircases, Axel appeared. "I have heard of your upcoming adventure," he announced, standing at the head of the table, "and I have decided to join you." He left to the bar and came back with 2 Åbros and a Finnish dictionary, and so we started the second round. The game was pretty self-explanatory, presuming as we were that the game was in fact supposed to be played the way that we were playing it. We later found out that we had not been, but I didn't mind, having won both rounds quite convincingly. Then Jackson got the message. I downed my 4th beer, slotted the game back through the ordering hole, and we walked to Väståla. It was a simple case of crossing the road into the neighboring Union, through the ice and snow, inside and up some stairs. At least that was the foolproof plan. Angus and Sophangus stood there at the entrance in their bright pink overalls, beckoning us to hurry. We ran up to them and inside. We had organized this to a T. We were going to take advantage of the chaos and disorganization that would occur in Väståla after the dinner had been finished and the tables were being put away and the dance floor cleared. As staff and students milled around, preparing for the after-party, we would sneak in, completely smooth, merge into the crowd, and no one would suspect a thing. Axel sniffled from the cold as we stood inside the entrance and took off our various layers of coats. "Okay," Sophangus explained. "The pub is still open on the ground floor for regulars while the event happens upstairs. You guys need to go upstairs and hide for a little while until we come to get you." "Hide?" inquired Jackson, his voice slowing as it did when he suspected trouble. "In what sense are we hiding?" "I don't know. Angus is the one with the plan here." "And how are you going to know where we're hiding?" I asked. "Angus is going to be a distraction. Don't worry, trust me, this is going to work." Sophangus was getting flustered and excited. She was hardly a rule breaker, and this was up there with the most pointlessly illegal stuff we had done in Sweden yet. All 6 of us walked into the ground floor hub, had our ages checked, and stood around. Only us and the doorman in the room, the pub on our left, the private rooms on the right, and the staff staircase with the words "Endast personal" written in big, bold words straight ahead of us. Angus looked at us and, in her Norland style, enunciated loudly, "Okay." She walked up to the doorman, twice her age, and seemed to start flirting with him. I think that is what happened. Her voice usually sounded more chewy when she flirted. Sophangus rushed us 4 guys up the narrow stairs, not unlike the ones I had previously maneuvered in that wondrous and educational board game, and onto the mezzanine. There was absolutely no one there. We turned left into a big open room with walk-in cupboards and bathroom cubicles on each wall. The next thing we knew, Jackson, Tom, Axel, and I were standing on our own, silently, locked in a staff bathroom, thinking how ashamed our parents would be if they could see us now. The following minutes were some of the most intense of my life. We had been left, presumably to die, standing silently in a staff toilet, waiting for Angus or Sophangus to give us the all-clear and to get us to the after-party. Tom couldn't stop giggling. Jackson took out his phone to take pictures. Axel just stared blankly into the void. I really needed to use the bathroom. And as the minutes went interminably by, we heard the sounds of adults, students, and machines pass by and through the room we were connected to. We heard tables shuffling, basketballs bouncing, the shattering of glass, and all sorts of other terrifying noises in that cubicle. I had drunk 4 beers in quick succession, and in retrospect, they were probably not the best influence under the circumstances. Communication was difficult. We talked in high registers, in both broken Swedish and German, and using interesting hand signals. Sometimes a member of staff would stand silently outside the room. I have no idea if anybody heard us in there. Axel leaned forward towards me. "Guys, I'm feeling kinda ill." He then immediately collapsed onto me, and it took the help of Tom and Jackson to get him sitting down on the toilet seat. "Sorry guys, I think I passed out." I unlocked the door and walked out into the main room again. We had been locked in that bathroom for 36 minutes. A member of staff walked past, unaware of the three guys standing cramped in a toilet stall with another having just walked out, and I asked him, "Ursäkta mig, kan vi få vatten för min vän? Han är sjuk." With a grave appearance and tone, he looked at Axel and back at me and replied, "Ja visst, en minut," and walked off with a mournful gait. 5 or 6 female members of staff began appearing around us, asking if we needed help, and soon a small crowd of them began to congregate around Axel. He now stood at the bathroom door, and when he received his glass of water, he explained to the worried ladies around him that he had just felt a little poorly and would be okay. He reluctantly agreed that he needed to go home, and just as we were about to walk him towards the staff stairs again, Angus walked in around the corner with a look of utter bewilderment that is expressed when one has left us alone for an hour. She beckoned urgently to us with a grin, and so we walked to the main stairs, bidding farewell to Axel as he started down the stairs on his walk home, and Tom, Jackson, Angus, and I walked ourselves up the stairs to join Safangus and to participate in GRUNK night. I have never been blackout drunk. I always remember everything. During the rest of that night, I drank at least 6 more beers, danced with Angus, and fell over. I stole someone's hat, another person's waistcoat, another's white shirt. I slow danced with Tom and many other people, threw up in the bathroom while bantering with Jackson, unscrewed a light bulb and attempted to flush it down one of the toilets, got stopped by Jackson. I proceeded to steal building equipment and hide it in my jacket when he wasn't looking, stole a chair in the mezzanine and tried to get it up a flight of stairs, got halfway, got tired, went back upstairs, danced with Safangus, fell over again, was forced to give all the clothes I'd been stealing back to their angry owners, went back downstairs to use the bathroom again, found the chair was still there, and so immediately carried it up onto the dance hall. The swing jazz was at its peak, and I felt like Kerouac himself as I sprawled myself out on a chair in the middle of the vibrant dance hall. It must have been fate, because a trumpeter in the band would only minutes later jump onto the chair and lead the song's climactic solo as we watched in adoration. The music stopped. I tried to steal a large wooden sign with a duck on it, along with some industrial tape. I only succeeded in the latter. The night finished, and we walked outside into the snow and made our way to Max, the fast food palace in the center of town. I befriended a green-haired man who sat next to us. He told us his name was Max. I promised I would visit him in Sky City. Our group disbanded finally and went home. I walked back with Safangus, got into an argument with Safangus by the tube tracks, went home, and didn't talk to Safangus for a month. Then I'm pretty sure I just went to sleep. I never did visit Max. The problem was that the drinking was getting incessant, much like it had back home. I needed a change of scene, and I knew my friends felt the same. GRUNK night may have been the peak of hooliganism up until that point, but it certainly felt like we had to keep ourselves under control. There had been other nights, like when Jackson was stuck on top of the fridge and wouldn't come down, where I began to feel that the drinking was beginning to get ridiculous and overshadow everything else. We had to channel ourselves towards something greater. Over February, Tom and I started doing our own thing. After Swedish class on a Tuesday and Thursday evening, we would proceed to visit a student union pub, try out different burgers on the menu as part of an ongoing review. We decided that the Lammburgare at Gotlands was the best the Uppsala diet had to offer. It was a fantastic burger. On Valentine's Day, I discovered that I was autistic. Or at least, through the power of pub psychoanalysis, we collectively agreed without my consent that this was the case. Valentine's Day depressed me every single year, and so as an antidote, we exchange students, all single ourselves, went to Norrlands for a quiet drink to ignore that fact. It was around this point that we met Katja. Katja was very rude from the moment I met her. Jackson had brought her along for the fun, and she seemed to make a bad impression upon everyone she spoke to. She made a point of correcting our English with a mangled form of speech whose origin I have no idea. Upon explaining that we were ourselves native English speakers, she quickly backtracked, before later going on the offensive again, claiming we were wrong. I will never forget the way she pronounced archipelago. She announced to us that she was in fact from Saucetown, and regularly made trips to and from the place. Since December, our family had been discussing the possibility of going to that legendary city, though it was very tough organizing different people who studied different subjects and at different levels, to all have the exact same set of days free. We all agreed that we should make an attempt to go whilst we still had time left in Uppsala. The logistics could come later. Tom got incredibly drunk and chundered multiple times in the pub toilets, and so we took him home. Sephangus and I brewed him up a fish finger sandwich on a hot pan, greased between 2 slices of bread, the great British cuisine for which he was eternally grateful. Another week brought another night out, and one I am not particularly proud of. We were especially depraved at Norrlands, and we drank and ruined everyone's nights. The next day, Jackson invited us all out for tea at Hugo's, though I was the only one willing to go. Sitting with a cup of hot Earl Grey, a cinnamon bun, and a large hangover, I watched Jackson as he took action and got us on the trail to Saucetown. Right there and then, he found the right slot that people were free on, booked tube tickies as well as a hostel. We were on our way. I'm not sure how he was able to be so orderly, and to organize a group of such useless people together, but I am eternally thankful that he did. Our fate was sealed from that moment onward. Little happened in the following few weeks. We spoke little of Saucetown unless someone tried to organize an event on that weekend, and we were to remember that we were going. It turned out that only 4 of us would be going. Tom, Jackson, Axel, and myself. Maybe Katja would come along too, but most of us, read myself, were not exactly looking forward to the prospect of that occurring. Much of the rest of the time was spent trying to calm down. We met for lunch in some unions, watched terrible movies in the evenings, and went to our classes. Most of all, we just engaged in the sensible Uppsala day life. A friend came to visit whom I knew from back home, so I showed her around for a weekend. I even did my own little trip up north to Hudiksvall, where there wasn't much to see, but there is always something valuable in time alone in a distant town. I went skiing for the first time, a pleasant and painful disaster, but by now Saucetown was being discussed, and I was looking forward to a more bearable climate. I've always loved the snow, but the slush that forms all over a town in late winter was beginning to take over Uppsala, and we hoped that Saucetown would be at least a little more brown down south. If it seems like we did little to no preparation before going to Saucetown, you would be absolutely correct in that assumption. The day before, the 4 sauce boys, as we now triumphantly called ourselves, met up for the Östgöta waffle lunch. Here we planned our very vague holiday, which was going to consist of going to Saucetown, maybe going to the archipelago, eating, drinking. By the end of our committee, we had all firmly decided that having no plan might in fact be the best possible option.
Chapter 3 Blåtåget. One of my favorite things to do on long journeys was caricatures. In my tiny little moleskin journal, I would draw the folks around me, trying to capture their expressions in a way that best suited them. I called them caricatures because I'm too much of a coward to admit that I have no talent for drawing. The tube was moving, and I scribbled away with my pencil. They loved it and took handsome posing pictures next to their portraits, appreciating the likeness. Axel was nursing a hangover and obsessively ate fruit with blue cheese as his cure-all. While I had been writing, Tom and Axel had run off to the restaurant car to cause havoc. They came back with 3 hot chocolates and a big pile of pastries for the trip. They never explained how it took them around 45 minutes to achieve so, and I didn't ask. Then they got back, sneakily jammed on Åbro in between the seat and the window and rested my elbow on it. The tube conductors here were like the Gestapo, wandering up and down the carriage every 30 seconds looking for victims, so we had a hard job of getting ourselves sloshed under the circumstances. Tom's G&T in a hip flask idea had turned out to be a roaring success and had earned him the handshakes of almost every man and woman on the carriage. He was covered, as was Axel, with the pear water. Jackson was taking it easy by comparison, a teetotaler as I lived and breathed. That's why they call me Detox Jackson. The general nonsense continued for hours. The whole journey in itself from Uppsala to Saucetown can take around 4.5 hours without interruption, and thankfully we were speeding on through Södermanland and Katja's mother country. Speaking of Katja, she continued to sit far away, almost 10 seats away. She was just far enough away that we couldn't hear her. She was too quiet up close. But she was too close that we could clearly see her staring at us, that it was awkward. No matter, the sauce boys were together and the engine was running. We could hear Standolphus calling, and we yearned for the sweet, sultry sound of his voice. As we headed southwest, the map on the table showed us the little towns we would be passing by and through. I saw Karlstad and wondered when I was going to see the rally there, and if Jakob would be interested. I thought that I should really give that guy a call. My brain was all messed up and upside down, and I was leaving Uppsala to get away from the madness. Instead, I was traveling straight into the heart of darkness, as though the sun was setting down to its last rays, and like Bernadotte on his horse viewing the ruin of Austerlitz, I knew that I had come to Saucetown to feel alive again, to see the world's spirit atop the city mountain. 2 more stops to go. The second, Saucetown. The first, Alingsås, its outer boundary. Tom prodded the map he had spread out in front of him with a finger, looked each of us in the eye, and firmly said, "That's where we belong." Day passed into night. We lost Katja almost immediately. The tube slowed down to a snail's pace, just as it had done at Uppsala. Standing up, we gathered our bags and coats and left the tube. Then, of course, with a crowd of people around us. It had become busier as we'd gone on our way. We forgot about our friends sitting half a carriage away. As always happens, we had stood up too quickly and had to wait for a while before we moved anywhere. It would have been better to just have stayed sitting all this time. My mind started to wander, and I started to think about my ex-girlfriend probably having sex with someone else, and I started to feel depressed. "Hey, Rain Man, snap out of it," Tom scolded me. "Don't call me Rain Man," was all I could say. Katja turned up again when we were outside. We found a place to stand, the 4 of us guys, as we looked around and tried to find her. We heard the sound of heavy grating metal as a nearby drainage gutter was lifted up. Katja climbed up from the sewer. "Oh, hi guys, I didn't see you there," she laughed. She stopped laughing and immediately drew her face seriously. "I need to look for my friend, and then I need to go to my home." We were all a bit perturbed and had assumed she would be seeing us this evening. Well, no loss on our part, I suppose to myself. Turned out Katja had a friend who had jumped on the tube illegally at some point during the voyage. Lilja was now somewhere in the crowd looking for us. We were on the ADD again, and Jackson just started spinning around on the spot and crashing into things. Axel went to put some things in the bin by the little station stop and ended up pulling a bunch of fruit out of there. We opened a banana and had a bite. Still good. We wondered what other treasures this great city had to offer. Weren't even off the tube platform, and we had already pulled the city apart like the wax of a great cheese. On the platform, the snow was definitely still here. Saucetown lies on the coast, so I wasn't expecting so much snow, but at least the weather had made up its mind one way or the other. I loved snow more than anything else, and knew this might be the last time I saw it all year. The next minute, a man in a tiny truck drove out of a narrow passage into the middle of a public platform, gathered up the snow, and took it away. All this happened in my time. Katja found Lilja, and everyone was happy. We could go and get out of this place. Lilja had a dark coat, rather plain brown hair, and a pretty smile. She gave a polite hello to everyone, eager as much as us to get out of the cold and hardly inclined for Swedish conversation. Us boys, too, were all a bit halfway done in the skämt department, so we weren't feeling the weather all that much. Jackson just kept spinning around, and Tom was asking Lilja if she liked jazz. So we left. This tube station was unremarkable, other than that it was a tube station. Busy on a Friday evening, with a high ceiling, some old stone, and expensive glass. Something like that. We walked past the side of the building once we had left the platform together as a group of 6, then found ourselves in the main square of the city. Everything was a bit jumbled, and it was dark, but there was a great open area with a pair of trams running in opposite directions ahead of us, and a couple of kiosks. Otherwise, it was all open space, dotted everywhere with people going in every direction with every purpose. It was so good to be free again in a foreign land. Lilia and I will go now, Katja told us. Oh, okay, Jackson said. Jackson was our de facto leader at this point, the lead diplomat in dealing with Katja. They exchanged a few details between them because, guess what, we were going to Katja's favorite place in the whole world, the archipelago. We would see her tomorrow morning, and until then, have a great evening. I thought, damn her and her politeness and loveliness. All of a sudden, these bubonic bulbs began to grow over Katja's skin, up her neck, and on her hands. They were filled with a thick, hot green pus, and they started to pop and drip and leak all over the floor. She let go a howl, and the air was filled with her shrieking as she combusted then and there. After half a minute, the hot, smoking pus was all that remained of her. We said goodbye to Lilia and started with Jackson's lead to head to our abode. We were on our way, and it took time to get off the great square. Following that were railings by the side of the cobbled road that guarded people from falling into the canals. The water was reflecting off of the glamorous old buildings across from the water. It looked absolutely freezing. Took out my camera and got a few funny pictures as we kept walking. I didn't know where. Jackson was firmly in charge at this point and decided that we should get some din-din. All we had for the past few hours at this point was pear water and some blue cheese. Jackson spotted a little Chinese place which looked generally out of the way and kitsch enough for all our tastes. It was welcome respite and good food, hot noodles and soup, but on an empty stomach my body wasn't ready for the spice, and the next thing I knew, Club Shima was ready to open, and I was needed in the bathroom. Tom, Jackson, and Axel were all busy with their food and sobering up a little, so I made my excuses and headed off. I must have been in there for 30 minutes. When I got back, everyone else was finished and waiting for me just a little bit. My meal was still, 3/4 full? And I knew I probably wasn't going to eat anything else between this point and tomorrow's breakfast. I managed to aggravate my stomach just a little bit more with a few mouthfuls, and then called it a day. We all paid and headed back on our way again. Next stop was the hostel, and to get all our stuff off our backs. It was absolutely beautiful there. The land was sloping up and down in the hills and flows, while the street our hostel lay on had buildings on one side of the road and wet rock cliffs on the other. Buildings would poke up from holes on all sides, while a great church stood on one mound, and we couldn't even see the top. The great rose window was reflecting off the moon, and we took that for a sign that the big guy that we had on good ground. "Mr. Moonlight, baby, what did I tell ya?" Axel grinned from ear to ear. Just round the corner was an Italian restaurant, and we'd all made a verbal remark that we should eat there the following evening. Jackson said he knew the chef, but couldn't remember his name. We asked how that was the case, but he told us to remain calm. But I knew better, and I wouldn't trust Jackson with my sister. It was a complicated process getting through the door. There were no human beings to let us in. This was the glorious 21st century after all. So Jackson had to find the specific code that would open the door to the hostel on his phone. Only problem was, he didn't have any internet on his phone. So Axel comes along and manages to get Jackson's phone connected to some dude's printer in one of the buildings, and from there it gets a little bite of internet. Don't ask me how, but it worked. Anywho, after about 10 minutes of standing by the front door, we got ourselves in. There was, naturally, nobody in the main front room, as simple as it was to greet us. So we just went ahead and pocketed as many biscuits and mints as were available on the front desk. There were rows of tiny boxes attached to the wall, and Jackson put up a code in and retrieved our golden key from within. "Down the corridor and to the right," Jackson told us. The corridor itself was pretty long. We encountered some very young girls coming the other way with pizza boxes, shouting loudly and drunkenly. Behind us, we heard the sound of angry, naked Germans. Jackson found the room and inserted the golden key into the lock. An incredibly normal room. There were 2 bunk beds and a single bed for the 4 of us. Perfect. I took the first side on the left with Axel above me. Tom was at the end of the room with Jackson above him. Within minutes of settling down, we were bored and wanted to see the city. As Axel lay in bed, he observed a massive, colorful poster on the wall opposite him of a famous rock star. "Who is that? Standolphus?" "The very same," I remarked. "The 8th member of the Beatles." Did you guys know Nelson Mandela was in the Beatles? We all know that Nelson Mandela was in the Beatles. For those of you who don't know, Nelson Mandela was the primary drummer of the Beatles in their early years until 1962, when he had led the band after being arrested by the apartheid government of South Africa for conspiring to overthrow the state. He was imprisoned on Robben Island for 27 years before international pressure saw his release in 1989. He would later win the 1994 South African general election and serve as the country's president for 5 years. His career is also remarkable in that he was the only member of the Beatles who was not implanted at any point by the CIA. Standolphus was his replacement. Out of nowhere, a sudden melody started to play from someone's electronic device. Axel grinned a menacing grin at us as Edvard Grieg started turning up his violin. Axel started laughing in French, and tension mounted while the hull of the Mountain King began to shake the floor. "Why is the ground shaking?" I asked, terrified. "That's Standolphus coming to get ya." That's Standolphus coming to get ya. Axel was on the carpet now, scraping his shoes off the floor. The Lonkeys appeared from nowhere, and drinking resumed. We tried to find something we all liked, so Stando's picture inspired us to put on the Beatles record where John Lennon makes the sex noises. Jackson began to tell us the story of how Standolphus got his name. Alina was here, maybe a few years ago, I don't remember. She went off for some weekend to Saucetown, and when she came back she wouldn't stop going on about the chef in the restaurant. He had a weird name, I think it was Italian? Standolphus. I'm going to call him Standolphus from here on in. He had on the full regalia, white from head to toe, with a big chef's hat, and he ended up serving all the food himself. I think Alina said he was both the waiter and the chef. "So he runs the whole restaurant by himself?" Tom asked. "Let's find out. Tomorrow's dinner." "Agreed," we murmured. It was nice to have plans. John Lennon's sex noises were really starting to frighten us, so I quickly pulled back a couple of pork lonkins. John Lennon's sex noises were really starting to frighten us, so I quickly pulled back a couple of pork lonkies, threw them in the bin from my side of the room. On the spare bed, we had accumulated a pile of our bags and their contents. Fruit, mostly pears, pastries, cans, and bottles of Boozahol, phones, and all the spare clothes hangers that came with the flat. Jackson was using a makeshift bowl and blasting his phone speaker through it to amplify everything. It was our best time.
Chapter 4, The Saucetown Special. Grieg was on our minds when we finally headed out on the town of Saucetown, ready for some bagels and sauce. Tom suggested that we get garlic boats on the way there, and we obliged, except for Askell, who was vegan at the time. By this point, we were on some semi-busy streets and heading our course for the center of town according to Jackson's map. On the way, he got a phone call from Katya, who is now home and trying to organize with Jackson about what we were doing the following Saturday morning. We were going to see the dreaded Archipelago with her and Lily, it seemed. Oh joy. But before that we were off to the Salty Seaman, a pirate bar, and, apparently, the greatest in all of Saucetown. "Did you hear that, boys?" Jackson called. "We're off to the Archipelago tomorrow morning, bright and early." It was 10 p.m. by this point. "Ha ha ha!" We all grunted together in agreement. "Ha ha ha!" Did you guys ever hear about Alexander Graham Bell, the guy who stole the telephone? What about him? He had some brilliant quote. I don't remember how it goes exactly, but it was something like, "I can predict a future where one day every town will have its own telephone." What a schmuck. Schmuck means jewelry in German. What does AGB know? He's dead. Even Alexander Graham Bell couldn't outrun death. The Salty Seaman turned out to be really classy. The music was loud and the nectar was cheap for Sweden. I got into an argument with Jackson about drum hiss when some other Swedish dudes joined our table, there being no room. We started buying rounds, so the best thing they had on tap was Grängesberg, and there'd probably be more taste and alcohol than my own piss. We brought enough Obros to last us a while, thankfully. The godforsaken town probably didn't even serve Falcon. God, I wished I hadn't downed those lonkies already. The Swedish dudes asked us what our plans were for the evening. We told them we were going to the only place in town we knew where things were hanging, Club Pulverizer. They advised us against it, but as this was our first night, we decided to make our own mistakes and go anyway. They were cool, and I actually owe them like half a day's salary in collective nectar points. It was bloody freezing by this point. We had taken all our layers with us from the hostel, but even then Saucetown is on the coast. That biting wind really cuts through you, no matter how well dressed you are. Jackson, as usual, took the lead, and we headed slightly downhill. The classy pirate pub had been on a commercial street by the Blåtåget, with pubs and clubs and various late-night establishments on our side, whilst the daytime knitting and soap shops lined the other side. It was pretty big, and I ventured we were somewhere near the middle of the city. The river seemed to separate the town into its various districts, of each which, while distinct in the daytime, in the nighttime forms a veritable spiderweb of linked pubs and clubs, leading a traveler in or out of the city as they wish. The bright lights were leading us closer to the river, or at least a stream leading to it. There was a huge cylindrical public toilet in the middle of this old square, and Jackson needed a piss. It was like the TARDIS. Upon pressing the open button on the door, the whole thing firmly locked itself, and a great whooshing noise sounded from within. This carried on for 30 seconds until the door of the toilet very slowly started to open from left to right. As it opened, the light from within was a perfect white, like Archbishop Gabriel was about to emerge. In a kind and smooth Swedish voice, it told us that you may now enter the toilet. Jackson hugged each one of us in turn, and then told me that he'd miss me most of all. He stepped in, and the door started to close interminably slowly behind him. It gave him time to wave at us all individually. The door closed, and the airlock fastened it shut until Jackson's journey was over. We were all pretty pished, and Tom handed me his pear water G&T, which was now mixed together into a mighty brew in his hip flask. It hit me hard, and for a brief second my sobriety kicked in and told me that I left my hat in the salty seaman. I told Tom and Axel and ran back, all my layers flapping about me. Speaking of the TARDIS, my scarf was about 3 sizes too big for any normal person, and it fell off my neck as I was running up the pavement back to the main street again. I came back for it, of course, but being all out of lonkies, my sugar level was stupidly low. I was a shivering wreck by the time I got back to the salty seaman, and the Swedish dudes had vacated the residence. My hat, however, was untouched and lying on the table of the pub. I ran all the way back to the giant cylindrical public toilet and found only Axel there. Where is everybody? Tom went for a slash in the TARDIS, and Jackson's out looking for you. Wait, you didn't see him? Like his Brazilian cousin, Jackson had scooted away and would scoot back eventually. Why he had scooted off, nobody knew. Sometimes he just got to scoot. Jackson came back, and Tom left the TARDIS, and we all started off again. We crossed the small side of the river over a cute little white bridge. I wanted to stop for a second just to take in the moment, but we were on our way to Club Pulverizer, and nothing was going to stop the inevitable march of progress. Progress can't be stopped, Tom told me. That's why they call it progress. He smiled a reassuring smile and passed me his pear water. He looked like a babushka, and I think he wanted it that way. Major snag. We got to the club, Club Pulverizer, and what an appropriate name it was. At the base of Skansen-Kronan, the great Mount Pulverizer that the pilgrims of old would climb to look over greater Hagastans menacing the rest of Saucetown below. Even at night we could make out the outline of the great hill. One day, Tom said, I'm going to climb that. How about right now? Suggested Axel. They both walked right past the club and started marching uphill. We physically dragged them back and reminded them of the plan. Most clubs have speakers outside that play for the folks standing around in the queue waiting to get in. Club Pulverizer played in the Hall of the Mountain King. We took it as a sign and lined up. Only one problem, though. It cost 120 big ones to get in. 120 money units? Axel parroted for the narrator. Why do people go to clubs? The joke was on us because we queued anyway. We got close to the door, and a bouncer came down the queue, sized up Jackson, and ushered him in through the front door. You'll do, the man said. With Jackson having been taken prisoner and forced to pay 120 money units for his trouble, the rest of us 3 sauce boys decided to save our dear leader and head in. Dear readers, after taking off 120 money units from your pocket at the door, the very first thing they demand you do on the inside is to pay an extra 20 big ones so that the club can protect your belongings, coats, and other layers. I thought, screw that, and kept all my stuff on. I walked right there up to the bar in an undershirt, an overshirt, a jumper, a jacket, and a thick woolen scarf, not to mention my 2 pairs of trousers. I was here to cause trouble, and I didn't particularly want to pay for the trouble of causing trouble. They only had Prelude below at the bar. If we wanted to buy something a little more expensive, it was going to set us back big time. Jackson rescued, the four of us gathered together and pondered on what to get. The other three had deflowered themselves at the wardrobe, and I was the only one in full outdoor clothing in the whole bar, but I was damned if this club was going to pulverize me. The name was almost poetic. The genuine example of willful destruction of self-esteem and financial saving, all because us young people wanted to drink outside of our homes. More than anything, I just wanted to stay home and relax with a couple more Obros and then pass out to some Steely Dan. But as a wise man once said, you can't always get what you wangus. There was no Obro and no self-esteem at this bar. The Prips piss water costed 52 big ones, and I got myself one for me and one for Tom because I think I owed him or something. Axel and Jackson got something that was about 5 money units more heavily priced, and by the looks of things the hike was probably worth it. I swilled my drink in misery and started to think I might be too old for clubs and pubs. Club Pulverizer is shaped like a punctured lung. The music sounds the same. We rounded a corner and headed to the main section of the club, where the noise was a bit clearer and folks were dancing. The other three headed to the dance floor whilst I downed my drink and stood around staring at stuff. I felt like stealing and got on my way. Some bouncers were standing around and I took it that they were checking out for any trouble. I stood not too far from this one guy, and every time he looked away, I would take a coat hanger from the trolley next to me and stuff it into the inside of my jacket. I did this for a couple of minutes until I had about 3 or 4, and then got bored and walked away. Axel and Tom and Jackson were all dancing together, and the music was vulgar, and it was embarrassing to watch this sorry sight. We must have been the youngest ones there by a scale of about 10 years or so. This was not our scene. I went to the toilet to take a leak without any shimas for the first time that day. Sitting in the cubicle, I opened up the big box that contains all the toilet paper and stole some for myself. Next thing I knew, my coat had 2 full toilet paper rolls and 3 or 4 coat hangers, giving me what looked like voluptuous breasts. Basically 10 minutes had passed and the rest were already bored of dancing. Unless Death Grips comes on this very instant, I'm going upstairs, Jackson declared. We went upstairs. It was way quieter up there. The music was quieter and in a bit of a better mood. The DJ was playing more goth and synth-oriented stuff, while the dancers were a bit younger. I think my drink even tasted better up there. Axel bought us all a round of drinks, and when we had 6 drinks on our table, including 2 extra that Tom and Axel had swiped from downstairs, there was a little glass of flowers completely off-center, and in my autism I rearranged it to the middle, discovering that we were sitting at the stickiest table in Saucetown. I retracted my hand and almost lost a layer of skin for my trouble. Fuck me if I'm paying 52 big ones for Prip's piss water. That's the Democrats for you, Tom remarked. We stayed here for a little while, half an hour, maybe an hour, just absorbing the scene. Tunes were coming on we knew and actually wanted to hear. This night was now going well. Jackson announced that he needed to sober up. The queue for the bar was really big at this point. Geez, oh man, we all said in collective unison. This is just nuts. Instead of queuing, Jackson just pulled the flowers outside of the glass and drank the flower water. We all laughed. Drinkin' Jackson, drinking his flower water. Don't judge me. Only God can judge me. You know you're not supposed to drink flower water, right? Yeah, dude, I'm pretty sure that shit's poisonous. Jackson took our badgering to heart, and in his drunken hysteria, actually believed the nonsense we were feeding him. I liked the look of the flowers and shoved them inside my jacket along with the 2 tubes of toilet roll and 3 or 4 coat hangers. I had a feel. 4. There were 4 coat hangers. Jackson remained distraught regarding his consumption of the flower water, and so we decided to depart from this godforsaken hellhole. Club Pulverizer? You could say that again. Let's scram-a-lam-a-ding-dong, quoth Axel. By this time the DJ had been playing around with the smoke machine on the side of the setup. At first it had been cool to have some Depeche Mode playing with a little bit of smoke on the side for ambience, but at this point I could barely see Axel across the table ahead of me. We scram-a-lam-a-ding-donged their way downstairs. Tom and Axel saw 2 untouched glasses and got themselves some free piss. I saw that the staff entrance toward the back room in the kitchen was wide open, so walked straight in and got a couple of the good ones. Oh, bros, straight into the jacket. I looked for lunkies, but after hearing other folks wandering around, I decided to get out of there. I was in serious danger of these items spilling out of my jacket, and I was thinking it was time to stop stealing for a while. We were gone now, well pulverized and looking for forgiveness from somebody up above. Disillusioned and frightened, most of us were pretty hungry again, so we made for the local Bright place. There were a couple of local pizza takeaways that were packed to the brim, but instead we just went to the local NORAD, home of beef security. Our beef needed securing, and Axel was a vegan, so we waltzed straight in. Tom asked us, "Are you guys seriously sure about the flower water?" "We're sure, dude," we all told him. "But don't they put chemicals in the water to make it flower water? To help the flowers grow? Maybe those are the same chemicals that turn the frogs gay." Ha ha ha. Dude, go get some food. Tom and Jackson have NORADs all over the states, so they felt right at home. Axel and I had churning stomachs, and although I was hungry, I decided I would be worse off with some processed shit clogging up my arteries, secure beef or otherwise. Swedish food standards are the same as any other food standards, and no beef security was going to convince me of healthy eating. We all went to the counter regardless. Jackson led, as always. "Hello, sir. I'll have myself some beef security with a couple of apples and a small fry." "Yeah, sir. Small fry coming up." We were impressed with Jackson's attempt at the local lingo and the sheer confidence with which he exuded his new persona as a Saucetownie. The service brought him just what he ordered, a burger and some fizzy orange pop. Tom got himself two of the biggest, most secure burgers NORAD had to offer. That's why they call me Jumbo Tom. Time passed and the night had long since peaked. Attention turned to the following morning. Geez, what time was it? It was around 1 a.m., and I could tell that Axel especially was suffering from 2 nights in a row of no rest. Jackson said to fuck the archipelago and that we should just sleep in. Tom was having none of it. "What's to stop it? Let's just get up early and go see the place." "Dude, I'm going to be fucked if I wake up anything earlier than 10 tomorrow." "Don't worry about it. Nothing's fucked. Let's just get ourselves some food, get home, get a bit of a drunken sleep, and we'll be right as rain on the boat tomorrow." "Do we have to?" "Yeah, I'm very much not feeling like getting up for the Gulag Archipelago tomorrow," I said. "It's not Gulag, it's just Katya." "Yeah." Tom looked at us all. "Look, we're in Saucetown for the first time. Who the hell knows when we're going to be here again? This is basically a once-in-a-lifetime trip for some of us. Let's make it memorable." He sat back. "Come on, guys, we're sitting here in fucking NORAD. There are a million NORADs in the world, and we came to Saucetown and could have gone anywhere, but we came here. Let's see something unique for once. It's so hard to get anywhere and do anything these days. Let's just go and we'll appreciate it for what it is." I nodded and agreed, as did the rest. Tom was probably right, but I still wasn't sure if I could be arsed with the archipelago first thing on a Saturday morning. I said, "Honestly, what's important to me is that we're together and we do something. It really doesn't bother me what we do. It never does. I don't mind just dicking around for a weekend. This may be the only time we ever do this. Let's make it worth something whatever we do." "We are having fun, aren't we?" "Yeah, I mean, it's good to be out of town for a while. Nothing quite like soul isolation in a foreign country, in a foreign town where nobody knows you. It's you guys that are important." The hostel was booming with sounds of laughter and music and illicit noises. We got to our room, pissed, brushed our teeth, and were lying in bed before long. "Ray," Tom said from across the black room, "tell us that story about how you lost your virginity." The other two hadn't heard it, and with a drunken chuckle I obliged. "That's a good one." So we're sitting on the bed making out, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. So I'm trying to take her bra off and completely failing. It's funny and charming at first, but after a full 30 seconds or a minute of it, it's just embarrassing. So I have to literally climb behind her while she sits on the bed and I try to take off her bra from behind. I get it off, and she turns around and looks me dead in the eye and says, "You know Ray Parker Jr. is a very good-looking man for his age." "Ray Parker Jr., I say. The Ghostbusters guy?" To this day, I have no understanding of why she was thinking of Ray Parker Jr. Was she just thinking of celebrities with the same name as me? Axel commented, "I must say I don't think I've ever just sat and thought about Ray Parker Jr. before. I suppose he is." Anyway, the rest of the night went off smoothly, but geez, she was a real charmer. Okay, somebody else tell a story. "I've got one," said Tom. "A friend of mine, Isaac, had a birthday party back when I was 11 or 12, something like that. Anyway, he invited his friends over, and it wasn't really even a close friend of his, just someone he knew. On the day, though, there were like 3 guests including me, and it was super tragic. So I think at some point he'd spoken to me about religion or spiritualism not long before that. Did you guys ever get into a conversation about mysticism when you were 12? We laughed without committing. So yeah, there was Isaac, me, and like 2 other guests. Their back garden was huge though, and his parents had rented a bouncy castle and were playing music from it. It was really weird and awkward, and back then when I was 12, my mom would drop me off at a party and pick me up that evening, so there was no hope of escape. So yeah, Isaac's mom walks in the door and starts asking us if we knew who L. Ron Hubbard is. The Scientology guy? Yep, the very same. Turns out they were Scientologists and they were having a Scientologist's birthday party. Fantastic. Why are you even there? I don't know. I guess it was because we'd had some talk about mysticism or something a few weeks before. He must have thought I was a Scientologist, or at least interested. He laughed. So yeah, they went on with this stuff all night, and when my mom came to pick me up, they gave her a piece of paper which had a personality test for her to do. What'd she do with it? She just threw it out of the car. My mom might be a lot of things, but she's not a Scientologist. It was probably close to 3 a.m., and the patter was dying out. We collapsed into a drunken sleep.
Chapter 5. Angry Naked Germans. I woke up feeling like death. Angry naked Germans ran screaming down the corridor behind my head. With that, it sounded like those underage pizza girls from the previous evening were running and screaming along with them. Maybe they'd had a party last night, I thought. Usually I had dreams, but last night I had absolutely nothing to dream about. Pure bliss. Of course, now I had to deal with the consequences. When Tom and Jackson loudly announced their awakening around the same time, it was pretty easy to tell they were feeling the same way. Jackson asked the time, Tom said it's time for him to get a watch, and Oxel says it's 9:30 in the morning. Ouch, Jackson says. Yeah, we're not going to the archipelago, I don't think. Why not, I ask, humming. Jackson replied, well, if we were going there, we were probably supposed to leave around an hour ago. Did nobody set an alarm? Everyone shrugged. Oops. In that case, I suggested, let's all get up and take the day as we want to then. It's better not having something we have to do than it is doing whatever we want at whatever speed we want. I took a little wince at myself for my endless long-windedness. I was quite sure that it made sense and everyone understood. Quiet grunting of approval filled the room, while Tom laughed into his pillow. You okay there, bud? Yep. Okay, Jackson took over again. Well, there's a whole list of things we can do. Did anyone have anywhere they wanted to go? Silence for a few moments, everyone shrugging their shoulders. Did nobody make any plan whatsoever? His voice climbing a little. No, not really, we mumbled. Jackson relaxed. Okay, well, let's just get ready, get some sauce, and head out on the town. First things first, shower. I had a detox method for coping with the crapula. To begin with, I would go into the shower and scrub myself completely clean, and move around as much as my body will allow me. Get those pores open and the filth out of my system. Next thing, to shave. For some reason, it gave me psychological pleasure to shave when I'm hungover, and see my face nice and clean. Not that it mattered. I could always see my own exhaustion in the mirror, and practice making smiles. After that, I would usually open up all the windows in the house, and eat as much fruit and vegetables out of the fridge that my stomach could handle. Here, I had to make do. Tom and I wanted to shower immediately, so we decided to split ourselves into 2 groups. Besides, we had checked and there were 3 or 4 showers on the premises anyway. So me and Tom first, then Joxil second. The shower room was tiled, long and thin, unisex whilst very public. Thankfully it was empty, and my prudish Britishness could rest a while. Tom picked his cubicle, I picked mine. Semi-decent shower, I would rate the shower itself 7 out of 10. For the experience of showering in the hostel, I would have to write strong dislike. We had been showering only for a few minutes when I started to notice that over the sound of the water coming from the tap, hitting the floor, gurgling down the drain, I started to hear voices. It was a common sound in hostels, young people chatting away to another in a foreign tongue. What was strange here, though, was the sound kept getting louder. It sounded like every few seconds another voice entered the shower room, until there was a great din that drowned out even the sound of the water hitting my head. There must have been 50 people out there, I thought. They were brushing against my shower curtain, and I got a quick glimpse of, as I had guessed, 50 angry naked Germans. Shit, I thought. How are we going to get out of this one? Out of nowhere they started barking, shouting things at Tom and I. They were marking their territory, and my grandmother must have been half French, because I immediately switched off the shower, grabbed my things, and hurried back to the room, past a crowd of, as previously described, 50 angry naked Germans. They all stood with their hands on their hips, angry and naked, and shouting stuff at me in German. They filled the room from wall to wall, angry and naked. The mirrors along the back wall only made their number seem double. Tom escaped close behind me as we were routed out of the shower room within seconds. We returned to our room, sopping wet and dripping all over the carpet floor. "Don't go to the shower, honestly, guys," Tom was telling Jackson. "Why not? What happened?" "It's not time." Jackson took charge again. "Okay, now I'm not saying we have to, but I've been messaging Katya, and it seems perfectly possible that we can still go to the archipelago if we hurry soon. I say, let's get our stuff now and go straight to the docks." At that moment there was a rapping on the door. Once again the distant sound of angry naked German voices was heard from the corridor. Fate was giving us a sign. We decided to stay in for half an hour until they were gone. There would be no archipelago today. 4 different people of differing personalities end up having different diets. That's fine at a restaurant, maybe, but actually working together to get some kind of nutrition that we could all agree on was difficult. We walked around the Ica down the road for quite some time, and all we ended up with were a few baguettes, a few cartons of pear water, and a big jar of peanut butter. I had to renege, and we ended up getting smooth, even though crunchy is objectively better. When we left, we already decided we needed more pear water, so Axel popped back in to get some. We did a U-turn faster than May, and ran through some wheat fields off to a cafe for a bite to eat. Jackson told us that it was less than a kilometer to Bagelton. The great stone cliffs jutted up all over the town. We were surrounded on all sides by great tower block buildings of a yellow-brown color, built directly into the rock. There was confusion at the bagel parlor. Jackson sat down at the table, opposite me, with a bagel on his plate, unfilled. Warm, but empty. He looked at my own, filled to the brim with salmon and cream cheese, and decided that something had gone wrong with his order. "What happened to your bagel, Jackson?" I asked. "You know, I'm not 100% sure," he replied. "I ordered the bagel, came here, thought I heard my order, then saw the bagel lying there at the counter and took it. But it's an empty bagel." "I know. Weird," he revved. "Did you pay for the bagel, Jackson?" Axel asked. He was a Swede and knew how these things worked. "I think I did. Oh wait, no I didn't." "Did you steal a bagel, Jackson?" Axel asked. "You know, I think I did. I should probably take it back. Or," he emphasized, leaning up close to the table, "I could just eat this bagel." "But there's nothing in it," I informed him. "There's nothing stronger than the human imagination, Ray." We sat and ate our bagel brunch breakfast, known in Bagelton as a triple B. BBB. The cafe was mad noisy, a popular pad. Young couples ate together, old folks shuffled around together. They had a big queue for the toilet, seeing as there were around 30 or so customers and one hole in the ground. I ended up going myself when the line got shorter, and found a wondrous world of discovery inside. Sitting down, I had the toilet door opposite me with a great glass mirror, so I could observe myself taking a dump. Another wall-sized mirror on my right meant that I could observe myself shitting my guts out via a side angle if I so chose. My doctor told me about 2 years prior that I was in a risk group for bowel cancer, and all that cream cheese was starting to sober me up to the fact that I shouldn't be having a case of the Shimas all day every day. I put it to the back of my mind and headed back for the Sauce Boys. God help the poor bastard who went to the loo after me. Our intention was the great Mount Pulverizer, but the first hill we ended up climbing was the one on which held aloft the university. Saucetown University sat in its stately pose, overlooking the commoners on the busy main road at the foot of the hill where we stood. At our level was a great open torg, with brown brick houses 7 or 8 stories up that stood opposite the hill. 100 years ago they were built for people, but nowadays all the ground floor places were shops. In the torg were many sculptures, probably loaned or made the university and out for public display. We walked together, hand in hand, through a fertility arch, and felt the glow of Standolphus radiate within us. Music was playing out of the buses in Saucetown. Where the destination name should have been, we instead learned about the feelings of the bus itself. Angered, stabby, to name 2 such expressed emotions. The windows were tinted, so we never saw the bus drivers or the passengers. I dropped the pear water on the pavement, and the others cursed me. In Dickensian fashion we watched as the last swirls of the sweet elixir started to pour slowly down the drain on the roadside. Distant sirens wailed, and we all became suddenly alert. We ran across the road in traffic and climbed up the hill to the university. It was Saturday, so the area would be quiet, and Jackson's bagel crimes could remain unresolved for the time being. It looked nothing more than a little sad on the premises of the university that day. In an early Nordic March, the trees were almost entirely barren. The wind chill had followed us up from Uppsala. Damn, it's probably even worse here, I thought, being beside the sea and all. Tom, as if reading my thoughts, said out loud, "Fuck the archipelago, if you know what I'm saying." "Don't worry about the archipelago, it's not fucked," Jackson said, as we climbed the tarmac path, very steep and smooth under our feet. "We can go tomorrow." I murmured disagreement, and Axel chimed in. "I don't know, Jackson. Can I be asked going to there tomorrow? We only have one weekend, and if it's cold here, I can imagine it would be really fucking cold out there." Up here, the grand stately buildings of the university were really just regular houses, possibly repurposed over the years to serve as educational facilities. I couldn't imagine people having actually lived here a century ago, but from the looks of things, that was very likely. This path we were walking up led us to a very small courtyard, with a few entrances to various departments of the university. It seemed this was only one part of the overall campus, and clearly every door was shut for the weekend. We noticed that the sirens had reached a consistent tone, and that the police were probably tracing us right now from the pear juice. There were cameras on every wall, in true inclusive fashion, so we huddled together and went round the back. Around the back it was a dead end. The path just went around the university building, then to a small metal observation point that looked out over the grand boulevard. It was easy to tell that this was not a public space, but we started hearing panicked voices and realized that we were being followed. Of course there were cameras here too. The whole thing would be on film. The Saucetown swine were armed. Dressed all in black with tinted shields and balaclavas, they came in a group of a dozen or so, running up the hill in their heavily padded gear. We all hurried into the observation post, with Tom, Axel, and I covering Jackson from view in a kind of triangle. With our jackets, we reckoned we could disguise him, but Jackson was the tallest of us bar me, and his big head poked out from above us. The swinesmen saw us and all pulled out their baguettes. One at the front shouted, "Händer upp, kolv ner, ingen skämt," or some shit in Swedish, and we raised our arms in defeat. They shackled us all together using one chain-linked handcuff and escorted us down the hill and into a big black armored police van. One more victory for the communists. Hill number 2 was the one we had been waiting for since it had amazed us at the eponymous club. Mount Pulverizer is a little like Mount Everest, in the fact that, with the latter, the higher you get, the more you start reaching zones where the ice has preserved all sorts of things over the years. More specifically, there's a famous dead zone where climbers have died in their attempt to reach the summit. Mount Pulverizer was in a sense the same mountain. Over the years, various people had either died or just left their stuff in their attempt to climb this hill. Admittedly, it was not quite so high as Everest, but people had treated it just the same. Strewn about the pathway up the hill are, to this day I suppose, old children's toys, animal hutches with no animals in them, people's clothes ranging from socks to coats and hats. Strange ceramic sculptures signpost the way up, which was far steeper than any sensible citizen would be willing to climb in their hometown. We were alone up here, just as we wanted. Tom passed me some pear water, lifting a finger to tell me that it was our last carton. The trees were still dead, the pathway was still muddy, and the weather was still cold with a biting wind. It took us around 20 minutes to navigate a path that seemed to have been made through frequency rather than deliberation. I turned around and could see the big cathedral opposite our hostel from here. At the top of Mount Pulverizer, the district of Haga sprawled out beneath us. The slope became a plateau, and a single tower with a great phallic point at the top dominated in the center of the summit. On our side, the ground was overgrown, and I became more and more aware that we were not on the correct side to climb the hill. In front of us, we saw a handrail, and walking up to it got a clear view of Haga. It was as if we had suddenly been transported to Italy. The houses in Haga are packed together very tightly. One needs to squint or be at the right angle to properly see where the roads and alleys run through that area. The roofs are copper-tiled, sloping down one way or the other to allow the rain to bounce gently off and into the street. Most of the houses seemed to be residential, and whilst there was no great Italian bustle, it was the Swedish equivalent of busy down there. On Mount Pulverizer there was no noise other than the Mountain King noise that seemed to ride on the wind like our great tolling bell. Oxel opened his mouth in an expressionless yawn. Jackson opened his carton and drank some pear water. It had been a long time. He walked over to the rails where a German couple were standing in a quiet moment together. We could hear their accent and then discern their words from quite far away. "I want a picture!" Jackson shouted at us, startling the couple. So naturally, in our modern age, all three of Jackson's friends got their phones and cameras out to take a lovely photo of the man himself with his pear juice on top of Mount Pulverizer. Jackson honed very loudly and started chugging the pear water into his mouth. We honed right back at him, and with every swallow of the juice, Jackson's fingernails began to change color. The Hagaplan started to sing at us from down below, but the real hell was coming from beside Jackson, where the Germans began to get angry, and a little bit naked. What we were thinking, I don't know. As quickly as we had climbed it, we needed to get off this dreadful mountain. To distract the annoyed, half-naked Germans, Tom threw a bunch of bread at Jackson, and the albino pigeons surrounded him before too long to provide a distraction. We were out of there. Pigeons notwithstanding, we were surviving by our wits and our ways being the wrong ones, and our wits at an end. Our appearances were starting to deteriorate. I felt days' worth of unshaved stubble growing over my face. Oxel had a 1,000-yard stare, and didn't seem able to close his mouth anymore. Tom's eyes were starting to look menacing and unhinged. He was covered in crumbs and began to Slav squat and talk to the pigeons intermittently. Jackson, likewise, was covered in pear water that ran down his coat and trousers. He and Tom started to hick together. Oxel and I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they seemed to understand one another. Were you tortured by your own thirst in those pleasures that you seek, that made you Tom the Curious, that makes you James the Weak? Back down the mountain. There was only one place left for us, and that was the cold, empty, open streets on the Saucetown circuit, where we deserved. We went around Haga. It wasn't time. We felt that the lower we were, the safer we would be. From the top of the mountain, the saucy river was visible as it wound its delta fingers through the city center like a national guitar. Thank you, Paul. Tom told me. I'd heard stories before I came here, and I guess now that we're here, they're true. Slippery Johannes. He was this homeless guy who became famous. He was even on SVT a few years ago. I don't know if this is true, so don't quote me on it. But what happened was basically that he had nowhere to live. He was kind of drunk, and so he would sneak into the library toilets in his hometown. I think it was Gävle. And then when the staff all left in the evening, he would come out, clear a library shelf, and go to sleep on it. He would sleep on the bookshelf like one of those Japanese pod hotels where you basically pay money to sleep in a coffin. Except this guy was doing it for free. He was super famous for a while, because they found out about him for obvious reasons, kicked him out of the library in Gävle, and he managed instead to find his way to Uppsala. I guess he jumped on a tube, but the important thing is that he got to Uppsala and did the exact same fucking thing. Sneaks into the toilet, just like we did on GRUNK night, waits for the staff to all leave, goes into the library and clears a big pile of books off the shelf and goes to sleep on it. I asked, was he sleeping on top of the shelf, or just on one of the rows? How would I know? Anyway, you can guess. Same thing happens. He gets kicked out of Uppsala and then finds his way to Sky City. The news pick it up that the exact same thing has happened twice in separate towns. So some people on social media are now looking for the dude. Slippery Johannes, they called him. I don't remember exactly what the word was in Swedish, but I think the translation is slippery. This slippery homeless guy they couldn't catch. They were on the search for him and waiting to see where he would turn up, because he did this multiple times. They found him eventually in Sky City, probably in Södermalm, knowing the kind of people who live there. Someone tracked him, found him there, waited until everyone had left the library, and reported him to the police claiming they'd seen him. A big shame, they didn't even let him sleep. So anyway, SVT and the TV companies get wind of this, and then they send in their own folks to report on the arrest as it happens. It even gets on the TV. My grandma calls me the next weekend asking me if I saw Slippery Johannes getting arrested. She knows I care about that kind of thing. The police go in, grab Johannes, take him out, and the TV companies start trying to shove questions in his face mid-arrest. He's resisting a little bit, but he gets close enough to one of the television microphones whilst the police are pushing back reporters. They ask him something, and he looks directly at the microphone, and boosh! A pause. Boosh what? I ask. He disappears right into thin air, right there on national television. Because there are no homeless people in Sweden.
Chapter 6. We were riding the crusp of a great and beautiful wave. We found ourselves at Göta River, the saucy river, according to the locals. It had little streams and offshoots, and it goes all over town, like Mälaren in Sky City. It makes nice open spaces, brilliant views, the kind of place you would actually want to live. Saucetown has never really needed to advertise when it comes to such beautiful winding rivers, TARDIS toilets, death mountains. The natural beauty of the area speaks for itself. Fly me to the moon, fly me to a star, but there are no stars in the Saucetown sky. They're all on the ground. The esplanade we stood on followed the river upstream, sloping slightly to the left. There were hundreds of benches in nice private spots on both sides of the river, each covered by trees and street lamps. There was an ample throng of people crowding up the pathway, kids, mothers with kids, fathers with kids, prams with kids. We wondered where all the in-between people were, seeing that it was a Saturday and all. Good bench nearby, nobody around. Axel sat down. Everyone else stood, looming over him. Time for lunch, and for him most of all. He had been very tired after such a long morning. Together, we all pulled out our collective lunch. Between us, we had a few baguettes, remaining pear water, of course, as well as the tub of peanut butter and some individual snacks that we weren't sharing. Axel, the youngest, got the first and mightiest king share of the bread. The bread king Wong himself would have been proud at the handfuls the Swede pulled off that loaf. Next up, the peanut butter. One hand on the bread pile. Picked up a piece. The other hand on the jar. The bread went into the jar. It squished around, pressing against the glass as it picked up each and every single essence of gooey peanut butter goodness from the side of the jar. A momentary flick of the wrist, a loose grip, and everything fell to entropy. Axel dropped the jar and the bread. Both scattered into his lap, smearing the delicious peanut buttery mess all over himself and the bench and the ground. We chuckled as friends do. Ha ha ha. Then we couldn't stop laughing. Then Axel began to cry. He had been reduced to an organism less than human, one which was unable to even eat properly in public. His entrails began spilling out his own legs, and he lost much of his motor skills. Next came the seagulls. First there was a tiny city bird, a tit of some breed or another. It jumped over to have a quick peck at the tiny pieces of peanut butter bread scattered all over the floor. Delicious. Next came a pigeon or two. They fluttered over some unknown location up there in the sky. Flutter, 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 they came down. Together, they too stuck their beaks in where it didn't belong. Bash, 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 the ground they did, munching on the delicious, gooey, buttery, sugary, salty bread. The fluttering got louder when a seagull arrived, and by a minute's passing we were up to our balls in birds. They were all around us, hundreds of them, thousands, millions. We couldn't escape. Axel's tears were no longer tears of laughter, but instead tears of real, unequivocal horror at the situation unfolding in front of his eyes. Between us, Jackson and I went to either side of Axel and lifted him up via his shoulders, off of the bench and out to safety. The seagulls were cawing and lunging at us, whilst others were circling overhead. Tom took a cloth and doused it in pear water before smearing it all over Axel's legs in an attempt to get the peanut butter off. For the time being, it seemed to do the trick, and together we counted to 3 before rushing through the birds as a giant human battering ram. We ran with great haste, and the birds fluttered everywhere in our wake. For a few moments, we lost direction of where we might be going, hopefully not into the river. But in the end we were safe, right on the path by which we had come up here in the first place. We turned around, and by our bench wandered over 100 angry birds of shapes and sizes, scrapping with each other, eating every single speck and crumb off the ground that they could find. They took up the whole walkway that spanned from the front of the bench all the way out to the river. Nobody could cross, and indeed, a man with a pram tried to pass by, but was unsuccessful. Over the cacophony of noise, we could hear the baby in the pram crying its eyes out. I wasn't sure, but I thought I could see the man make eye contact with me through the flurry of birds. The look of hate made me realize it was time for us to go. We unfortunately didn't get far. The path led directly to a bridge, and before the bridge was a large set of traffic lights and a great junction. Pedestrians had to go through a series of gauntlets and lights themselves just to traverse the thing. Seeing the first green mangus we jumped the lights and found ourselves on a small traffic island, thanking Standolphus above that we had escaped the situation physically unharmed and apparently without a single repercussion against us. For those things we could be truly thankful. In my compulsion, I wanted us to keep going, to get off this traffic island and go further away from the river, further towards safety. Tom clasped his hand on my shoulder and said, "It's not time." In a way I understood. So he stood there with Axel panting, having seen his life flash before his eyes. He looked utterly exhausted and said that he couldn't go on anymore. I felt fine, but had no idea how I looked to the others. I only hoped that I had the strength to appear healthy and happy and ready to face my demons. I needed the strength to keep us all going. We were all trying in our little ways, consciously or subconsciously, to make our way through the darkness together. 5 minutes or maybe more on the traffic island, regaining our breaths and our bearings, while I watched the river turn to salt. Like the RLC, we had eroded the very foundation upon which we stood, that had given us energy and life. "Come back, Mom and Dad. You're growing apart. You know that I'm growing up sad." We had to park Axel somewhere. He was getting out of hand. Walking down the boulevard, it was clear that after sauce, this town didn't amount to much. Oil did the same thing to my hometown. It took some small fishing village and made its people crazy rich roughnecks. The church on our left was the size of the Notre Dame, at least in this time before it had burned to the ground. On our right was one of those Steiner schools where they teach kids about music and stuff. I think it's a little late to note this, dear reader, but all this time, for some reason, because Jackson started pronouncing it back in Valladolid when we were stuck in the bathroom for 45 minutes, we had been pronouncing Axel like Excel, so like Axel. Dude, what would our parents think if they could see us now? I was chatting with Tom as we walked. Dude, I know, right? Jeez, oh man. Just imagine my dad's face of ultimate disappointment. Ultimate disappointment of ultimate destiny. Oh dude, have you heard that guy's new album? No, is it Mouth Dreams? Yeah, that's the one. Dude, that's been out for like 3 years at this point. But dude, Wonder and all the other stuff, we should be doing music like that. Absolutely. It would be nice to be doing some music of any kind. Dude, we suck. That's fair. Self-criticism is healthy. Before we got back to the Vasa church, we stopped by the public library. Jackson wanted to take a look around, piss in a corner, look at the books. Found some hundparkering for Axel, and chained him up like the dirty dog he was. He cried and wouldn't stop crying, so we just left him there. We were heartless, but it was necessary. No way were the library security going to let him in. Not that this was Paris or some shit. It's not like the security guards were everywhere, but there was at least one armed guard in each room, making sure the books were okay. Tom and I got halfway through the door when the guard stopped us to check our bags. They swiped the pear water out of my hand and threw it straight into the bin, no questions asked. He then spit in the bin before allowing us into the library. Art Deco floors and walls and ceilings and old-fashioned lift. The hall lobby was pretty wide, but the ceiling was super low. If it had been any lower, I would have had to duck to avoid getting a concussion. Jackson was gone through the metal detector and the ball checker, and we could see him blurred now behind the swinging blind door. It swung around like some intermediary between an old-fashioned office door in a film noir police station and one of those big wooden doors with brass knobs one finds in theaters or museums that could come from reconstructed beauty places. I didn't want to go through the ball checker, and I was pissed about the power water going to waste. Could still hear it dripping in the bin. Drip, drip, drip. And I lost my temper. Tom followed me out the entrance, and we heard the shrill screaming of Axel wailing against outside the front door. 2 guards stood above him, both armed with large black assault rifles that they were likely hitting him with to make him make sense. Upon rounding the entrance corner, we saw this scene, called Axel's name, and the 2 guards immediately pointed their assault rifles at us. "Saucetown swine," Tom whispered at my side. Through some difficult interpretation, we managed to find a middle language. Between all of us, my English, Tom's American, and the guard's Bagelton, we explained that Axel had only been chained there for a maximum of a few minutes, and so had kept there under the time necessary to avoid paying for keeping him there. The guards warned us that Axel was not recognized for that space, and that we should mind the signs in the future. We looked up. Registered dogs only. Douglas Adams would tell you they were big, friendly letters, but we knew what punishment lay beyond that sign. We removed Axel's manacles and placed them back against the cold stone wall, waited for Jackson to return, headed to the Great Vasa Church. Now, the thing about the Vasa Church is that it is unlike any church you will see in other towns, European or otherwise. It is almost sacrilegious in its display, in its everything. From any angle other than the front, it appears as any regular large church in a city. Shaped like a cross, rather Gothic-looking, a higher spire, lots of nice greenery, and a few graves around the back. Thank goodness for churches sometimes. Gives the town a little green patch, even if that green patch has a giant grey monolith towering over it. The Vasa Church has, above the front door, not a rose window the way you might find at the front of Notre Dame de Paris before it burned to the ground. Instead, there was a space reaching far back many meters into the old stonework of the church, and filled into the space was a gigantic carved metal structure of the old Swedish king Gustav Vasa. Above even God, apparently, Gustav sat on a throne watching anyone coming towards the church, holding in his hand a giant copper staff that he used to judge any and all who were coming praying that day. I would normally question such a design choice as being quite blasphemous, though later I found that this was a workers' church. The miners of nearby Spicetown traveled for miles from out of town to pray to Gustav, as they called him, the old god emperor, and the spiritual predecessor to the 12 Caesars of Saucetown. The inside of the church was very uninteresting. Standing around on the chuckies next to the greenery, the 4 of us regrouped, each taking out whatever food we had. We had plenty of bread and peanut butter, but absolutely no pear water. We considered taking some of the holy water, but we weren't sure if our flasks could dip in that angle. So we found a place in the park to sit for a while and sit, not think about anything, but just sit.
Chapter 7. The 12 Caesars of Saucetown. Saucetown is the kind of place that's described anthropomorphically, between 2 jobs. As a nation, it came about during the handover of power thanks to Old Boney in 1817. Well, Boney was dead by then, but regardless, there was a handover of power, and M. Bernadotte jumped into the hot seat as King of Sweden around that time. Of course, this made lots of the locals rather angry, as they wanted their own guy at the top of the tree. There were the usual protests, riots, attempts at insurrection that every country gets when there's a major handover. Sweden was different, though, and in an unexpected twist as a result of its various separated and isolated communities, there occurred radical splits and shifts in local ideologies that rebelled against the ruling classes to bring about their own way of things. Remember that France didn't just export their food, but also their continental rational ideas like revolution and putting 10 days in the week, and some of these ideas caught on in all sorts of places. Very soon the various towns and regions of Sweden were all breaking away and calling themselves the federated micro-nationalist states of whatever. Most were failures. A couple did survive and invented their own method of semi-autonomous rule that the new Swedish parliament tolerated, even if they did not directly approve of it. The most successful of these was Saucetown. The old city of Saucetown was and remains a heavily fortified port on the western coast of Sweden, south of Norway, in a prime position for restocking should conflict arise. Under the risk of having to blockade their own port, the Bernadottes and the parliament relented and allowed the farcical show of statehood to continue. A factory owner who produced sauces for local businesses named Alling ended up naturally succeeding to the de facto mayoral position, sweeping the initial Saucetown elections, later known as the Saucetown Civil Selections, of 1817. Alling was so popular, in fact, that he put forward sweeping legislation that saw the immediate granting of emergency powers to himself and his blood relatives. Very soon Saucetown had its own homegrown monarchy, and its suburban outskirts were now a border against the rest of the Swedish kingdom. Other states such as Gastown and Spicetown grew up in a similar way in their own parts of the country. Therefore, in its continued isolation in the modern era, Saucetown developed its own style as it always had under Swedish rule. Nationalism can be a strong driving force for change, and it allowed Saucetown to develop its own legitimate identity, to codify its local dialect, and to appear legitimate on the world stage. Of course, the Swedes compromised to allow this to happen. It was too much of a risk to send in the military and have a full-scale uprising on their hands. "We don't need another Saucetown," would be on the words of every interior minister dealing with local strikes for the next 200 years. Saucetown became an inspiration to others, though they were the first and only ones to make the dream a reality. Alling was something of a king president, ruling for close to 30 years. Whoever ran the Alling Sauce Company was the de facto king president of Saucetown, and so it has continued to this day. Quickly and quietly after the Great Depression, the town's autonomous status was revoked and the country became part of Sweden once again in 1930. However, in the 113 years of independence, Saucetown's culture thrived, building up recipes for foods, language forms alien to other Swedes, and systems of measurement nonsensical to the foreign eye. For instance, temperature is measured in fantigrade, symbolized by an upside-down F. Saucetown had 12 king presidents in all. In the Bagelton region, they are celebrated to this day as the 12 Caesars of Saucetown. For reasons unfortunately lost to us at the time of writing, they are celebrated primarily through 12 unique flavors of hot dog. A brown Caesar in Saucetown lingo is a hot dog. Burgers are seen as unfashionable, and Saucetownies do not eat them. A red Caesar is a brown Caesar with hot sauce. A white Caesar is a brown Caesar with ketchup. A yellow Caesar is a white Caesar with scrambled eggs dashed with salt and pepper. A green Caesar is a brown Caesar served with whole liquid beans. Liquid beans is Saucetownie lingo for coffee. A black Caesar is a brown Caesar soft-boiled and stuffed with sauerkraut. A pink Caesar is a brown Caesar stuffed with applesauce. A scarlet Caesar is combined red and white Caesar. A blue Caesar is a brown Caesar served with a side gorgonzola. A dirty Caesar is a brown Caesar served with cola. An Italian Caesar is a white Caesar served with local variety meats imported at the time of selling. A cottage Caesar is a brown Caesar with brown sauce. There exists a 13th Caesar, a recent invention, called the Augustus Caesar, which is a combination of a white Caesar and a pink Caesar. All other information regarding temperatures, hot dogs, and other cultural landmarks of Saucetown can be found in Appendix A. Footnote 1. Changes in fashionable eating have been observed in the Saucetown region in recent decades, with institutions such as NORAD and Standolphus Kitchen attempting to popularize the burger once again. Footnote 2. Gorgonzola is seen by many in the older generations of Saucetown to be an aphrodisiac. If a woman asks for the gorgonzola inside the hot dog bun instead of on the side, this is interpreted that the woman is pregnant or is currently attempting to conceive. Footnote 3. A famous punk band known as Dirty Caesar had its roots in Saucetown. However, their popularity was famously lost in a marketing blunder where they teamed up with Coca-Cola for an advertising campaign. The band were seen as selling out and have not seen success since the early 1980s. Footnote 4. Although the exact information is unknown, common belief indicates that the Italian Caesar is the original base model from which all other Caesar varieties stem.
Chapter 8. The Standolphus Engine, a.k.a. Strange Memories on This Nervous Night in Saucetown. We walked to the hostel. It was getting a bit later in the day, say 4 o'clock, and hunger was becoming a major problem. I could see it in Jackson's eyes, the hunger, not just for food, but for so much more. Fill in the blanks. We had been walking up and down the hilly, saucy streets, which seemed to just flow with the land in all the strangest ways. Houses would be built on long, thin wooden foundations to keep them from surviving some kind of San Franciscan earthquake. The vanity of the local population and builders got to all their heads and caused them to end up creating individual towers of Babel that reached into heaven, each higher than the other. Jackson found a gun on the ground. Someone had tied a rope around it in a very unconvincing knot. I deduced that the person who had done this probably wore Velcro and had dropped their gun. The rope went all the way around the barrel, but didn't actually cover the end or stop it from firing in any real way. Tom and Jackson, the Americans, were over the moon. I had never seen them as happy as when they had a gun between them. They pulled it out of their trousers and aimed at each other, safety on, safety off. Their voices descended into southern caricatures like they were Texas oil barons, and their feet started naturally dancing off the pavement steps. Lucky that this was an empty street. Too empty, in fact. Saturday late afternoon, nobody around us. Questions abounded as to the origin of the gun. Was this the very same gun that killed President Lincoln? Or Olof Palme? The mystery had been solved. After all this time, we had saved Olof Palme. It would make sense that it would be a rogue Saucetownie that murdered Herr Palme after all this time, especially during the troubles of the 1980s that plagued this coastal city at the time. See Appendix B. No answers came to us. Not sure that the hostel proprietor would approve of us handling firearms in their premises, but also, out of a sheer and natural distrust of Axel, we placed the gun high up on a windowsill for some old lady to discover when she got home. Poor her. We got off that street and made our way across a few main roads and into another old town residential district, much like Haga or Bagleton, except everything here held an orange hue. We saw high-up houses on questionable supports, strangely shaped and seemingly rebelling against the very ground they stood on. At surface level, a little local cafe stood with a couple of customers at the door, and we took the risk to go on inside. Above the door of the cafe was one word, kawaii. It didn't appear to be a cafe at all, if it weren't for the menu next to the front door. There were no outside tables, not unexpected for the temperature at this time of the year. The windows seemed to be completely steamed up or indeed covered up by a kind of gel or tar specifically to stop people seeing in or out. If I wasn't mistaken, I would have assumed that the queue of Saucetownies were all lining up to buy pharmaceuticals. The drugs were made clearer to us when we followed the queue inside. It was one of those bubble tea stores, smoky dens of madness. Smoking was absolutely illegal inside in Sweden, but here the folks turned a blind eye. A dense layer of smoky fog hovered at the ceiling, and very low and distant oriental music played from an unknown location. One short woman ran the counter, although I observed her regularly leave for long periods of time, returning empty-handed and idle. The counter itself was otherwise empty. No bell to get attention, except for a 20-kilogram golden, large-scale waving cat that absolutely dominated the room. No matter where you were, it saw you, its head rotating slightly from side to side, its hand waving in a gesture not unlike a Hitler salute. The woman showed us to our table, which was right next to the cat. We tried for conversation, but none of us could avoid its gaze. Jackson had ordered a coffee, but it came in a bubble tea carton. It seemed to be all espresso in more than half a liter. Knowing Jackson, I still expected him to drink it all. He remarked. chugging vast quantities down his throat. "That's a damn fine cup of coffee." We all groaned and pushed our chairs back. The short woman brought him his food, a slice of cherry pie dashed with whatever the Saucetownies have for custard. "Mmm," Jackson continued, savoring every bite loud enough that the whole establishment could hear him. "That's some good cherry pie. Mmm." The skin on his limbs was receding, decaying, hollowing out until there were only his bones left. Briefly, we could see the muscles press and expand against the bone, until a black, ink-like substance started pouring out and covering the skin around it like an open drain. Out of Jackson's shoulders came thin, stringy tentacles like black spaghetti, his mother's spaghetti, that began to flap around him, slap the table and the other patrons. It would have been comical, except that the ink kept flowing out of him, out of his eyes, and the tentacles grouped together, pressing the floor until Jackson's whole frame began to rise up out of his chair and out from the table. Lightning was striking outside, and a hurricane wind was forcing the door open and air into the cramped space. The fog had lifted out of the cafe, and the waving cat stopped waving. Jackson began breathing in a deep voice, at least an octave lower than his general voice would ever be capable of. Tom tells me that I began rocking back and forth, muttering, "Cherry pie," but I don't remember this. I just remember the waving cat on the counter as it stopped waving, and its eyes went from staring straight forward to slowly rising until the pupils were ascending into its skull. It had risen. Tom, Axel, and I moved our chairs back to give Jackson some space while he enjoyed the cherry pie, which he repeated was damn fine. As the tentacles receded, he reached for his pockets repeatedly, apparently looking for something. I guess he never found what he was looking for. Our hostel wasn't safe from danger either. Standolphus Rar appeared to have moved, or at least changed expression. It was hard to explain. The poster had hung above Axel's bed, and it was still there when we arrived in the room, apparently in the same position it always stood. Its expression had changed, almost as if it were judging us for what we had done, as if our collective consciousness had become the personality of the portrait. No time, I muttered. "Standolphus, Standolphus." We dropped off our things on our beds, grabbed some cash, and headed straight back out again. Surrounding Jackson, we manhandled him out of the room and into the street. At the restaurant, I ordered the coq au vin. During dinner, it felt like a time bomb was trying to go off. Everyone was on edge, Jackson especially. Every comment had to be repeated, had to be manipulated, edited, destroyed in some way. There was this accelerated entropy to our friendship, where it seemed the whole point of the trip was descending and descending, as we tested each other's capacity for willful self-debasement. Was it possible to go further? In what situation were we willing to draw attention to ourselves next? Would stealing be our peak? There was a disturbing ease in which we fell into this self-defeating relationship of mutually assured destruction. I demanded at the restaurant that we stop for just a little while. So we sat in silence at Standolphus's kitchen. It was one of those places which only had 2 or 3 dishes on the menu for each plate, and so Tom, Jackson, and Axel all ended up getting the vegetarian plate. Drinking was not exactly in the atmosphere among us. One drink did it. We were already full of pear water at that time regardless, and the mood was missing for further escalation. This was not the time nor the place, and there were many unspoken shared experiences, such as the knowledge that the peak had likely passed, and we were now entering the next stage of our trip, and therefore our lives. "We need to calm down," I said. "Agreed," Tom said, looking down at his plate, his elbows on the table. "Sometimes we have a habit of taking things too far." "What do you mean?" Jackson asked between mouthfuls of borscht. He was wolfing down his meal as if nothing absurd or unbelievable had occurred in the last few hours. "We tend to take things a little overboard from time to time. Jackson, don't you remember that time we went to Östgöta?" At this, Axel sneezed. "Bless you," I said. "But Axel, remember that time a few months back when we decided to get lunch together, and then you turned it from lunch into a waffle buffet at Östgöta, and then all you ate was waffles for lunch?" Axel piped in. "Yeah, dude, you had 8 waffles." "And 8 cup of coffee," remembered Jackson. "I was going to go to my lecture, but I was so high on sugar and caffeine that I had to go home to calm down. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound like you have a problem?" "A problem? Life is full of problems, dude, but you still have to live it. We're in this country that none of us are from, Technically Oxel too if you count the micro-nationalists. But dude, we're in some random town in the middle of nowhere and you're worried about what people think of us in some tiny restaurant on a side street? A saucy side street, Tom added. My point, I said, is that can we have a comparatively quiet night tonight? No more pulverizer, no more stealing, just a quiet come-down evening. And if we do feel like going out, we can do. Okay, everyone grumbled, annoyed at my increased whining. Tom asked us, did you ever hear the tragedy of when the bus drivers at my school went on strike? No, we all replied. Oh, really? I haven't told you this one? No. Okay, this is a good one. So when I was younger, we had one of those big yellow school buses to take us to school and back. But I don't remember the reason. But one day the drivers went on strike, or shit, I don't know. Maybe the buses broke down for the last time. Anyway, my friend Jackson, not you Jackson, another guy I used to know. Jackson? Yeah, he was a character. I have so many crazy stories about Jackson, like that time we all walked to Vancouver together. So this guy Jackson, I don't remember who it was, but I think it was his dad owned a limo company. And I'm not sure if the school asked or if he offered, but there was this one morning where the limo company decided to pick up all the kids and take them to school in place of the bus drivers. How old were you? I asked. I don't know, like 13 or 14? Everyone chuckled as they ate their food. Tom continued. So yeah, the best bit about this morning was that because it was a limo and the drivers were basically being paid to take us to school, the driver we had rolled down the window and asked us if we wanted to listen to music. There was me, Jackson himself, my friend Leonard, and 3 other dudes on the other side of the seats. The window rolls back up and fucking, of all the songs, Carry On My Wayward Son starts playing in the limo, full volume, as we drive down the main street in Portland. Fuck, it was amazing. It was sunny like 8:30 in the morning, fucking Kansas playing full blast, and that's it. That's a fucking amazing story. My life in Oregon was so surreal now that I come to think of it. Jackson joined. Do you ever think that? I think that pretty regularly. Think what? That my life was super surreal before I ever came to Saucetown. I talk to people and hear their stories. Then when I do the same thing and say some shit like, I ate 8 waffles, I think, that's not normal, is it? Yeah, I have the same thing, I said. Axel nodded. Nah, my life was pretty normal and boring until you guys came along. Tom chuckled. You're welcome. We were all finishing our food. Should we go home? I asked. Home? There's no home anymore. Oh shit, I meant the hostel. Yeah, sure. We broke a line and went straight back to the hostel. After much discussion, we had finally agreed to kidnap Standolphus and steal him from the kitchen back to our room at the hostel. When we, under the pretense of looking for the bathroom, walked straight through the sliding kitchen door and made to grab Stan, he welcomed us with open arms and agreed to come with us without bloodshed. As the sun's gonna shine on my back door someday. What did you say? I said nothing. We did not talk further. We used our hands instead. Words were replaced by actions. Dirty hands, clean money. You know what they say. Standolphus spread the blueprints over my bottom bunk dunna by the door. He showed us from start to finish exactly how to construct the engine. As he pointed to the various parts in their own steps, he emitted his own, unique of an atonal variety. It was not restricted to the 12-tone stepping, but made its own sound, A double sharp. I had heard Tom and Jackson make that noise the day before, while sipping their caps of coffee in Stalkin's Nation. How long ago that seemed now. Maybe Tom and Jackson had Saucetown blood, or maybe Standolphus was half Yank. There was so much I didn't know about the world. The whole room started to buzz with the ha-ha-haing. Not in an earthquake style, Star Trek shake, where it feels like the walls themselves will flip over, but instead in a kind of massage chair variety shaking. The whole room was buzzing like a bee's arse. A melody was picked up in the hum, first by Tom, then by Jackson, then myself and Axel. Axel's eyes widened, and he stared at his crotch and began to cry. Jackson shouted, Klaxon's blaring, Skaxel's a-comin'. Woo-woo! Tom screamed along. Yes, he grinned, rubbing his hands together and rocking back and forth. I started to rock back and forth too, as was in my nature, and backed against the wall of my bed. Tom's eyes widened, and he started staring at Axel with the face of a cannibal. Excel, he shouted. Come here and help us make the engine. The engine was on its way. Individual pairs had been placed in their own individual clear plastic bags, wrapped delicately by Jackson with Standolphus's supervision. Standolphus had been crouched, observing the handiwork, but now stood up and looked to the ceiling light. He glanced to his right, above my bed where I was sitting, and saw his own reflection at the end of Axel's dunna. "You guys like classical music?" he asked. "Boy, do we," said Jackson. Without even looking at his phone, and apparently without pushing any buttons either, Stando queued up Grieg's Hall of the Mountain King, and, in his deepest baritone, began to haw along. The engine was coming together nicely. I cowered by the foot of the bed until Stando himself looked at me and convinced me it was good. I took his outstretched hand and stood, observing Stando as if he were a wizard climbing to the top of the engine. "I wished I was a mole in the ground, I wished I was a mole in the ground, I was a mole in the ground, and ought I'd tear this mountain down, I wished I was a mole in the ground." As I was getting lower, Stando was getting higher. "But those gentlemen in blue and those in gray say I'll never, never see Mama again." Until he stopped, somewhere in the sky, his silhouette no longer moving. "Here we are, stuck by this river, you and I, underneath the sky that's ever falling, down, 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 ever falling down." I was sitting by the lake with Chris again. The clearness of the water astounded me. With the exception of the lapping of the waves against the shore, it felt like the earth had become still, that the clouds weren't moving, and that everything was important in this one moment. I'd always heard a person's brain can do that the dilation of time is often associated with brain power. A person undergoing a traumatic or emotionally draining event observes time more fully, and therefore feels like the event took far longer than it did, as if in slow motion. A time before lockdown and jobs and sitting at home all day every day. With those three, I could push myself to the limits of my sensibilities and emotions, waiting all the while for them to push me further. Saucetown to this day does not feel real. It was not a real place, and any further visit would remove the magic of surrealism that it provided. It was not a place to visit, but a control site through which to exercise and exorcise what we had to do, what we had to say. We didn't treat it as a real place. Even with Lilia there, it was only a figurative anchor keeping us to what reality had to say to us. Even after we returned, we spoke of Saucetown as a place of heavenly being, where reality in and of itself disintegrated to make way for us. It was a place of infinite possibility, where we were able to mold its very being at our will. Standolphus, of course, was not real, but he remains the very essence of what was connecting the four of us at the time. All the events of this story have been haphazardly thrown together, brought as one through prose and personal pictures, without which we would have forgotten the bulk of the story over time. By presenting this tale as hyper-surrealistic, we are in fact explaining the realism of the venture, and of where it took us. If life could exist like this, what was I doing returning home? There was nothing there, few people to see of worth. Every second spent in this new town slowly but surely removed the connection I had with my younger self, the version of myself that really didn't matter. It felt like removing a jacket, something heavy that had been on me, uncomfortable and unconscionable at this point. Saucetown had removed every idea of facade that had hung over our lives. 100% honest, we were at last living for once. By now I had woken up. Time had passed, and something had happened. Sound returned to the room. I was lying down in my bed, one arm behind my head. I could hear Axel on the bunk above me, rustling around and clearly handling something heavy. "Back you go, Stando," he said. "What's happening?" I asked. "Standolphus is going back in the wall, where he belongs. He can watch from there." A light clunk, and the sound of something being fitted into place. I raised up and put my feet by the edge of my bed. Tom and Jackson were still fiddling around with the engine, so I cannot imagine I had passed out for long. Standing up, I turned around to check what Axel was doing. He was fiddling around with Standolphus's picture on the wall. It had somehow come off from the end of his bed, and he was replacing it back on. The engine was by now complete. At the ceiling of our hostel room, there was a light emanating from the main socket. As there was enough room between the light and the ceiling, a plastic bag had been tightened, rolled, and attached to the top light. At the bottom end of this plastic bag, a coat hanger had been ripped through and hung itself further down. From that coat hanger was another plastic bag hung around it, with the main portion of the bag somewhere halfway between the floor and the ceiling. Suspended within this bag were an uneaten pear and Jackson's phone. On this phone was playing the movie du soir, War Games. We hit a slight snag with the engine, however. Genius as it was creating a small difficulty in how we were going to watch anything. The reason we had created the engine in the first place was because there was nowhere to watch a film, especially with just a phone to watch it on. We could rest Jackson's phone on a bag on the spare, unused bed that had been reserved for Standolphus. However, the distance between either Axel or my bunk and the phone was so great that nobody would be able to perceive anything. We attempted to place the phone on one of the bunk bed steps from various angles, but to no avail. That's how we came up with the engine. Tom horned, Axel horned, Jackson horned, I horned. We horned together. The face of Standolphus Rar on the wall smiled upon us, grew a beard, and was now Grieg. We were joyous. We did the only thing we knew now. We watched War Games. War Games is a classic film improved only by watching the film from a phone suspended from the ceiling. Our second snag involving watching the Hollywood blockbuster was in keeping the film still. Whilst we had the setup perfect, the phone faced straight down, clear through the plastic, while the three guys and I lay either on the spare bed or the hard carpet floor looking straight up. The issue remained in making sure absolutely no air blew towards the bag, or indeed, any particle at all would change the angle. The film started with the four of us making makeshift pillows and cushions to keep ourselves comfortable to watch the film. However, 3 or 4 minutes in, the bag was still turning clockwise, meaning that every one of us had to rotate ourselves horizontally to keep up with the gripping pace of the film, which was literally so great that it moved the phone around. We later realized that it was the audio from the phone that was pushing the film around. We watched War Games, and we wept. Sometime during the movie, Axel, who was lying next to me, turned his head to me and asked, "When was the last time you cared about something?" And a foghorn blared in the distance. Wiggin explained to the room. "The kid claims he was looking for a toy company," at which General McKittrick snorted. "Paul, I want you to find that password and remove it, put a tiger team on it, and beef up security around the Whopper." The canned studio audience bellowed with laughter, along with the four of us, and we knew we didn't want to be anywhere else. Berenger responded in outcry. "Beefed up? How about screwed up?" More laughter from the audience. "We're a little past that." That reminded me. I looked at my watch. It was 8 p.m. Time for bed.
Chapter 9. Sunday morning. Read Cale. It was the final morning. We had left for us some complimentary pears, avoided any more of the angry naked Germans from the previous morning, and got the hell out of the hostel while we still could. We didn't have much with us by this point, but what we did have was on us, held tightly on our person. Jackson recommended us some haga, and we agreed. Just down on the far side of Mount Pulverizer, we thought it would be the perfect refuge spot while we spent the rest of the day waiting for our tube to get back to Uppsala and Saucetown. We had the whole afternoon, however, what with the tube not leaving until dinner time, plenty more space and time to destroy. Katja and Jackson had been in contact on and off this whole time. She was Jackson's, and by extension our, only anchor to reality this whole time, while Stando had done his best to pull us away down a terrible road of abstraction and horror. Katja was a real and tangible terror indeed. She had recommended Jackson and us to visit Haga before we went, and it did not disappoint. A small district, distinct as Bagel Town, that looked like an old Sicilian village. From the top, the roof tiles were a bright orange red. We had noticed them from the previous day atop the city mountain. The buildings themselves were whitewashed plaster, while the homes had small staircases up the outside to separate the ground and upper floor houses from one another. Instead of a tarmac road, it was more of a dirt track. The closest technological achievements were the cobblestone paths that ran adjacent to many of the roads. Children ran around with hoops and sticks, while there was a strong smell of hay and horses. We had stepped back in time to find the great bun. Katja had said sacrifices would have to be made. They were, and we got lost very quickly down the endless romantic side streets. Tom thought he saw something and ran from us down some alley. We followed, not knowing what else to do, and next thing we knew, we were in a pile of kids and screaming adults. Multiple children grabbing at his legs. Tom came barreling back out of the alleyway with us. Children were all screaming and crying. "Run, Tom!" he shouted. "Run!" The great bun was soon found. Quest completed. A beautiful wood cafe, table service. Its whole entrance side made out of glass. One could see the world go by, every moment of every day from this angle. The four sauce boys sat down together to take some much-deserved respite. "En hagabulle," requested Axel. Each of us got a drink. Tom, Jackson, and Axel some rich black coffee in old, used, and vintage mugs. Myself a cup of Lady Grey milky beans in a chipped but shiny white cup. Time passed and apologies were made. The hagabulle arrived. The Great Bun was a legend in the Haga district. Much like in the rest of Saucetown and Greater Sweden, the people love a good cinnamon bun. Who doesn't? However, in keeping with local traditions, as well as an eccentric Saucetown Caesar attempts to give gifts to the workers to avoid a Bolshevik revolution a century prior, the buns at Haga were renamed Great Buns and were made to be 4 times larger than the average bulle, exactly to scale. Each Great Bun from Haga, GBH for short, has to be made identically, with twice as much butter as in a standard bun. With the sheer size and fat content, it is a challenge for any man, woman, child, or small family to consume. With the GBH in the center of our table, we tucked in. Half an hour later, we still weren't finished, and we didn't see ourselves able to. The owner of the cafe, who had been wiping a beer glass with a cloth constantly ever since we walked through the door, looked at us with a severe glare and spat on the floor. "Oh geez, this is going to be impossible to finish," Jackson said out loud. Too loudly. Other patrons at the cafe, mustachioed men and babushka ladies in shawls, started giving us the angry side-eye, and at Jackson's comment, the owner spat on the floor again. Without starting anything, we paid and got out of there as quickly as possible. Yet another area was dead to us forever. We were learning the hard way that the Saucetownese don't like outsiders, and they had long memories. Hagatown was full of deliciousies. It was like a culinary micronation within a town already famous for its timeless cuisine. Each place we passed was a cafe, a restaurant, a brasserie, a vendor, a greengroceries with their produce outside in baskets for the world to see. Every other establishment had showers leading down to basements where strange smells and noises emerged from. We couldn't believe our noses, and somewhat regretted having filled ourselves entirely for breakfast with a single GBH. Jackson got a text. Katja was on her way. She knew a place to eat. Our stomachs grumbled in a preemptive discomfort. So much food everywhere. I was getting dizzy. Saucetown savory rolls, SSRs, milky beans, scarlet Caesars, carbs of the day, wow no cow, we love balls. We were on the Times Square of Saucetown Saga district. The world was our oyster. Tom found us a shop to go visit to get away from the big noise. Maybe it was just a migraine coming on, but I needed to get out of there and inside somewhere quieter. Fortunately, this place had bright white lights aiming straight down at us from the ceiling. Where were we? Oh yes, a fashion vintage shop. The kind of place that sells old shitty clothes at large prices to get money out of children whose parents finance their fashionable individuality. All the hangers and cupboards and everything were all shiny and metal, reflecting the lights on the ceiling and giving me proper tension head. Tom wanted me to try on a bunch of silly hats, and I of course accepted. But beyond that, we all realized that we had to get out of Haga and back to Bagelton. We had a hangover. Skrattfest is my favorite word in Swedish, probably. There's no word quite like it. We met the merman and the lady with flowers in her hair. The flowers began to sprout out of every orifice in her body until she was merely a humanoid flower. All colors, all flowers, everything grew there. Trapped in a shop window, she began to stiffen as the flowers grew until she became totally still and never moved again. An ugly man tried to sell us some sauce bread, but we declined. In reality, it was clearly Tysk bread, but we didn't have the heart or the stomach to tell him so. Everyone has to make a living somehow, and he made his selling knock-off Saucetown bread to tourists. We were over the Saucy River for the final time. Pustervik and Pulverizer stood high up behind us like a great island, and we were at sea. Over the river, we were back in south-central Saucetown, where the various delta banks met up before branching into the western archipelago. The weather was holding up, the usual grey overcast, wet weather I was so used to from the seaside towns. We were just glad it wasn't raining. A couple of parks separated us from Katja, but we still managed to get sauce-tracked on the way there. Tom managed to get the tram angered again as it went past. The sky darkened, just as we were speaking about it. Classic. Naked stone women dressed in bare clothes atop fountains, where they must have been very cold much of the days. In fact, having a naked stone woman seemed something of a redundant way of producing water, as it rained all the time in Saucetown. Not that any four of us were against having saucy stone ladies posing in the rain, but it at least gave us the opportunity to take some pictures with our favorite stone women. Tom pointed at a saucy stone fountain lady and shouted for all the world to hear, "Hey Ray, she speaks almost as much as Metropolis does." I winced and began rocking back and forth. Then we were on the Kyrkogatan together. The weather continued to darken. We stood next to the entrance of Saucetown Citadel, the main cathedral of the city. Behind us, facing the church directly, made of stone, wielding a sword and riding a great steed, sat Gustav Adolphus, a ready reminder for the Bagel Boys and the sons of Saucetown just the level of danger the Saucetownies faced every day for a century under the threat of Swedish invasion. Why were the eyes of the world not on this proud people, staring extinction in the face of their journey to the promised land? After each shaking the hand of the mermen on our way into the church, we took off our shoes, our socks, and entered the plain white citadel. I'd never seen such a clean church as the way the Saucetownies look after their churches. The great entrance door to the cathedral was shut by a merman. Music began to play. Maybe it was the merman himself who played. We couldn't see. Axel collapsed, and his body began to steam. The organ was playing a singular drone in F-sharp minor with a diminished fifth. The devil's chord. Jackson, who had been generally quiet all morning, started to sweat himself and told me, "Ray, I can feel the damn fine cherry pie." Tom also looked to me for guidance. "Jeez, oh man, this is just nuts." There didn't appear to be a priest anywhere, so I had to make a quick matter of judgment. I picked up steamy Axel, while Tom picked up Jackson, whose tentacles were protruding from all of his orifices, like the flower woman, and we dragged them slowly from the citadel. Perhaps when our hearts were pure, we could face the Saucetown saints with thick conscience. We told ourselves, Tom and I, that we would try again when we returned one day. But we knew, as did Sam and Frodo, that there would be no return journey, Mr. Frodo. Oh, Sam, Mr. Frodo, oh, Sam, Mr. Frodo, oh, Sam, Mr. Frodo. Katja was all smiles when we saw her outside. Jaxel seemed revived after getting out of the citadel. I tipped the merman on behalf of the four of us, and Katja, who was with her friend Lilja from Friday, suggested we get some lunch to help revive us all. Time passed and something happened. We were sitting in a classy establishment for some soup buffet. The Saucetownies and the Swedes like to put French accents on some of their words to make themselves feel fancy and upper class. I'm sure we talked about something, the six of us, but I honestly don't remember what we could possibly have talked about. The Sauce Boys were losing all track of reality. This must have been the first normal, safe place we had been in many days. There was no Stando facing us through the bathroom mirror, no stone women with flowers in their orifices. I hope we were polite to Katja and Lilia, who were both very interested in knowing what we had got up to during our town in Saucetown. Between us, we came up with a well-fabricated story, which eventually unraveled, so we told all the saucy details of what would have gone down the last few days. Speaking about it helped. For an hour, Katja and Lilia were our therapists. And it was an hour, no more, no less. In spite of his honesty and his forthrightness, Jackson still seemed a broken man. He was looking up at the chandelier swinging above our table, lost in reflection of himself and the jewels. But he did calm down. I saw him improve. For a moment, he was human again. Tom and I used the bathroom. Axel stocked up on vegan sauce traps. Jackson chatted and chatted away with Katja. Ooh la la. We breathed a sigh of relief as the after effects from the church were off, and I went for more bread. Now, the sign on the soup buffet by the bowls and the soup, it said that the bread was complimentary. Therefore, by that logic, and seeing as we had paid for all of it, I decided that we could have as much bread as we wanted. It was complimentary, after all. All of a sudden, Tom appeared behind me, putting a hand on my left shoulder. "Take the bread," he said. "Take the bread." I shouldn't. I looked down, torn between my two destinies. "Do it," he muttered in a guttural tone. We looked around ourselves. We were the only two people at the buffet. We got to work, one bread in the right pocket, one bread in the left pocket, and one bread in the left coat pocket. Lots of space. 2 bread in the left coat pocket, 2 more bread in the right pocket, 1 bread in the inside lining pocket, 1 bread in the breast pocket, 4 bread on a plate, and take the plate upstairs for Jaxel to both take. It was a rush of time and emotions. The next thing I knew, I was upstairs and back on the comfortable sofa. Tom was across from me with the hick look in his eye. He stood up, started squatting, his arms far to the side of him. He looked down, then up at me, then down, then up at me. He was directly opposite me, at my height, even though I was sitting. He started one big, long breath, his head raising higher, and shouted, "Yep!" Smiled and sat down again. It was quite the spectacle. We redistributed the bread. "I don't steal their bread, comrades," I said to Jaxel. "I share our bread." And with the bread, we breaded out of the bread buffet, saying farewell to our beloved Katja, placed her witch's hat upon her head, and flew out of the second-story window, cackling, all the while in the way that only a saucy Swedish witch can cackle. The sauce boys? After enough sauce to dip our stolen bread into, we strategically shared it amongst our pockets for the long journey home that evening, and hon right out of the door. We were walking, the 4 of us, through the square and down a side route to the cobbled stones beneath our feet. And somewhere up there on a rooftop, we could hear the rebel yell of Standolphus, watching over us, revving. A local sauce shop next door was playing tinny music that reached the side road we found ourselves on. We recognized the music. It was Grieg. We were content. We were in Lidl. We needed sustenance. We needed sustenance that we could all eat. Damn be our various dietary restrictions and differences. It was an absolute balash to decide what to get. Obviously, we were all broke at all times every day, so there was that to take into consideration. And even though we had known each other for many months, we didn't often have to shop for food with one another. This was it, therefore. We got the best of the local delicacies, the legendary Saucetown Cruspies. They weren't sweets, they were absolutely savory. They weren't peanuts, but there were definitely nuts on the inside. They were salted nuts with some kind of extra salted shell on the outside, hard to seize in a bag. We took 2 bags. This was the kind of shit you don't get outside of Saucetown, the real sauce. Axel got a giant assortment of things. Fruit, cheese, plastic cutlery. So we were about to embark on a grand banquet on the tube journey back. The rest of us laughed for a minute, but then I wondered whether Axel had it right after all. This tube could be long and running. We looked at our watches. 3 p.m., plenty of time. The tube wasn't leaving for Uppsala until around 5:30 p.m. However, fatigue was setting in. We were getting fed up with everything. A weekend had been enough. Now, we're at the art gallery. Fantastic. I can still remember some of those pictures we saw that afternoon. I even met a friend from first year. She was at the exact place as we were at the same time in history. It was hard to believe. The whole event had been hard to believe, and disassociation was increasing the more we honk. Outside it was raining big time, so we all kind of split up to be with ourselves for a time, to just absorb into the art. With my friend, we observed a painting by Peter Severin Kröyer. The title, "Hip Hip Hurrah!" next to the painting was a long description of the painting itself. what it depicted, the background, and what it all meant. When I saw a family eating outside more than a century ago, the men in the pictures are dressed in their best clothes, gathered towards the back of the table with a drink in their hands. Their wives and relatives are mostly sitting, holding children, and grinning with delight themselves. This is a happy occasion. Something wonderful is being celebrated, and the time and place has been captured for eternity. Who these people were, perhaps it is known, but I do not wish to know. For myself and my friend Satori, whom I had bumped into at the Saucetown Gallery at the exact time, at that exact place in the world, it was a moment to sit, to observe, and to become transported into that universe, a simple, hyper-concentrated universe of celebration and family. We reconvened after a time apart by the Mummy exhibit. Tove Jansson's original art and engravings were there, and we felt privileged to have enjoyed this space and time stepping back. The time was drawing near to leave. We each got a different flavored sandwich from a nearby cafe, and we watched the traffic go by outside as the rain fell down. The tram continued to travel to Angered, and we ducked our heads in shame. But we had dodged enough responsibility for now. Time to go home. We had a lot of street water to wade through and a long way to walk. It must have taken about 20 minutes, while angered prams went past at breakneck speed, splashing up the street water at our way to the tuber. At the tuber, Jackson fantastically announced to the rest of us that he had no tube ticket home. Somehow, someway, he had booked his tube ticket for an hour prior, seeing as this was Saucetown and technically a sovereign state. There was no system in place that he could reuse the ticket for a different time. There was a boutique selling loose ones next to us, so the rest of us chipped in and got Jackson a flipper flavor while we waited for the tube. The absolute mad lad managed to get his ticket, and we stood around sipping as the tube got itself ready. Walking through the side door of the main depot building, I took the relevant blueprint documents from the safe, shot the guards, and boarded the back carriage of the tube. Before stepping on the tube, all four of us stopped as the strong, cold winds turned the rain to sleety, wet snow. Even in early March, we were still escaping winter.
Chapter 10, Satori in Västerås. Free seats on the tube, no reservation required. We walked up and down each carriage, looking for a place so all of us could sit in. On an upper deck, we came across a 4-person table and formed our territory. There were other folks around us, but they would soon leave. We had no doubt of that. We got ourselves comfortable, coats upper behind our arses, food on the table. I had my journal ready for some writing, and we all subconsciously acknowledged the oncoming 6-hour journey back home out of Saucetown. We didn't expect any issues, except maybe at the border, and that of course would be our first obstacle. Outside, the rain was drying more and more. The sleet was getting visibly thicker and thicker. By now the tube had got going and was almost at full speed out of the town. The lights were bright inside, and the reflection from the window obscured the Saucetown lights. Not that there was much to see, but it pushed us further into resignation and relaxation. Time went by and we started to eat. It was past 6 p.m. by now, and hunger was setting in. True, we'd just eaten at the cafe an hour or so previously, but a sandwich is a sandwich. A sandwich is a sandwich. Can't argue with that, Tom said to me, reading my thoughts. Geez, oh man, I responded. This is just nuts. Tom hucked, and I don't know what to tell him. All I ate now was another sandwich, some refreshing pear water, and Cruspies. I could just picture the state of my chimas when I was done eating that half kilo of peanuts. My reverie was cut short when we reached the border to Sweden at Alingsås. The tube slowed, and came to something of an abrupt halt. The lights dimmed a tiny bit, though the passengers continued as normal in their chit-chat and their absorption in their own little lives. A reminder that it was early March. It was now simply thick, unending snow out the window. Big chunky pieces fell from the sky and hit the glass and stuck right to it. Axel remarked that if we were too slow in getting going, our tube could get stuck in the snow. This is the blue tube, Jackson reminded him with a lowered eyebrow and a sneer. Those two sat across from one another, while I was on the forward-facing window seat with Tom across from me, Jackson on my right, Axel across from him. Understood? The carriage volume lowered as we heard that the border officers were entering from behind me. "Sometimes this happens," Axel informed us. "How does this happen?" I asked him. "Because people in countries don't listen to one another." The whole tube stood up and clapped. But yes, it happens sometimes. I guess they're worried about import-export or something, or criminals, or illegal aliens. This must be the only hard border in Europe, no? Other than Kaliningrad, probably. We chuckled and thought it was all rather exciting, seeing as it wasn't often that I especially had to go through hard borders. The Americans were more used to it than I, but you also have to remember, dear reader, that this was the year 2017 when the borders were only just starting to close. Notre Dame would be up for another 2 years yet. How lucky were we? The guards came up to us. They were dressed in full brown camouflage and had pistols publicly displayed on their belts. They had flat caps that they wore in a beret fashion and seemed more like actual soldiers than border guards. "They're hard to distinguish, aren't they?" Axel said to me, reading my mind. The guards spoke something in dialect to Axel, telling him to shut up. The officials asked for all of our passports together as a table. I pulled mine from my pocket and gave it straight to the man attending to us personally. No worries. I wondered what else the guards ever had to deal with. Soldiers in such small places were hardly necessary. In the case of any real attack, the Saucetownies would be overrun, but there's more to war than an invasion. So I guess the Saucetownies had their own guerrilla plans in place and didn't need too much of a military. Otherwise, I suppose boats would be checked. These guards probably didn't see much action except for checking passports and interesting foreigners, like us. "Vame's it ahead," the guard said to us out of nowhere. He was pointing with an accusatory finger towards our bag of Cruspies in the middle of the table. Before I had a chance to speak, Axel spoke up. "Mean." Axel was taking responsibility for the bag for no reason that I could understand. The guard gave us back our passports one by one. 2 Americans, 1 Brit, and 1 Swede. He hovered over the table and started speaking to all of us. "You know that it is illegal to transport food across the Saucetown-Sweden border without declaring it first. Regardless, Cruspies don't pass the strict Swedish food standard laws and so aren't allowed. You'll have to remove them." He pointed to Axel now. "Come with me." "Excel, no!" Jackson shouted and tried to stand up, but Axel did as he was told and walked off with the armed guard, who kept his left hand on his gun belt at all times. Carrying the bag of Cruspies with him as he did, it was a few minutes before our friend returned empty-handed. "They've made me throw it off the tube," he explained forlorn, sitting down in shame. "Well, that's okay. Anything else?" "Nope, just not to cause any trouble. They said someone else is going to speak to us when they come around again." "Okay." We understood. We had got off mostly scot-free, but Axel was bothered about losing the Cruspies. "It's not fair," he complained. "We didn't know that, and we were going to finish it within the next hour or so anyway." "I agree," I said, my temper rising. "Whoa, calm down there, Rain Man," Tom said at me. "Stop calling me Rain Man." "Well, you'd better stop rocking back and forth over there, Ray." I caught myself doing so. Damn it. I mean, it's why you and Metropolis are so perfect for each other. Her name is Zara. I wouldn't know so. The hick on his chin was beginning to grow, and he started to huck in his own little corner of the window across from me. The perfect double feature, the two of you, Metropolis and Rain Man. She's silent in German, and you're rocking back and forth, almost as if you were the dwarf fortress man. All this time bickering, chatting to guards, and we had not moved anywhere. In fact, we had to have been stationary for well over 45 minutes, and we were still not going anywhere. In the end, it took over an hour for the guards to harass everyone on the tube. We started seeing folks outside in the snow in the Alingsås station on the platform, carrying their luggage and belongings like it was some sort of old Soviet scene. Not everyone was making it home this cold winter night. The tube started, very slowly this time, aching and crying out at the snow that covered every centimeter of our path from now until home. It sped up, it lumbered, but it got up to speed and we were finally on our way home. By now it was 7 p.m. and we were wondering when we would even get home. We had only been moving around 20 to 30 minutes at this point. We all sighed together and looked around us. I took out my journal and started drawing my friends. Each of them, one by one, went under my pencil and rubber. There were more caricatures than portraits, but I was really trying. Tom first looked somewhat distant and away from me, his mouth open and his face unshaven. He looked out of sorts and unclean. Axel, peaceful, he looked down instead of to the side. His teeth showed, and he was smiling in a way, the kind of smile at peace with itself, not in a dumb way or a foolish face. Someone who has truly experienced life for a time and is just taking the time to process what has happened to them. He wore a woolly jumper, and in spite of everything that had happened to him, what might still happen to him, he seemed at the moment I drew him happy. Jackson also showed his teeth. He also smiled, but it wasn't the same kind of smile. It was the kind of tired, ironic smile that comes to the cynical. Jackson wasn't a cynical guy, typically. Some self-discovery was working itself on him for the time being. I remember now how Jackson had been when we first met, that he commented on my Scott Walker t-shirt, and look at us now. How had we sunk so low? We ate. As I drew, Axel had decorated some cheese for me, which said, I'm Ray. I was flattened and posed with the cheese, ate the cheese, made love to the cheese. I did not make love to the cheese. I was mature, as was the cheese. Finally, the tube conductor came to speak to us. She was an elderly lady, easily in her 60s, and probably in her 70s. She was very kind to us, but explained that there might be further complications from the Cruspies incident at the beginning of our tube journey. She asked for our addresses and asked who owned the Cruspies. We all owned up to our mistake collectively this time, and bygones were unofficially bygones. Her language was very strange. Axel would explain to us later on the journey that the native language of most Saucetown tube conductors is country Chinese. This was true, and has remained true for almost a century now, after the extravagant immigration policies of the third Saucetown Caesar. It was Saucetown Swedish, of that we had no doubt, but with added inflections. These extra inflections were alien to our uncultured ears, and it took a little time for us to understand her. Once again, she told us that she would return in a few hours with more news if and when there would be some. And a few hours later she did. Axel had just recently finished his banquet of apple and cheese when she came around again. She wanted to speak to him specifically in front of all of us, but he took his time to eat a big pile of cheese and apple, consuming every single piece of the fruit. Pips, stalk, everything. The rest of us were quite impressed. Eventually, she said, due to the delay of the tube on the way out of Saucetown because of some unruly passengers, we're too delayed to make it to Uppsala before nightfall. Even if you want to switch at Sky City, there will be no tubes leaving at that time. We looked around each other, uneasy. Okay, Jackson said for us, so what do we do? Well, we have organized a bus for those people going to Uppsala at Västerås. Västerås was a town about 90 minutes from Uppsala by bus. We reckoned that we would get to Västerås by 11 p.m. or so, meaning that we wouldn't be back home until well after midnight. We all nodded our approval of the idea. Okay. There won't be any tubes from Sky City northward, so you have to make sure you get off at Västerås, and there's a bus that has been booked for all the late passengers. It's just the one bus, so you won't have any trouble. We were very much relieved, as we had been concerned that we were in trouble. The gaiety returned, laughter, banquets, fizzy, sugary drinks, all the merriment of young people of the era. The tension having disappeared, we laid back and just let the hours pass before us. By the time we got to Västerås in the end, it was well after 11 p.m. The tube slowed down, crawling to a stop. We collected our bags, and with our winter clothes on, we waited at the door for a few minutes as the ride eventually came to a halt. Thud. Opening the door, the four of us stepped into the platform and straight into the godless heights of Västerås tube station. The outside was freezing, and we strode with our bags and coats straight through the sliding doors to the warm inside. The lights were up, all the shops were shuttered down, and the only other people in the station were two cleaners with machines and mops tidying up at the end of the day. We must have been the last tube in. We rubbed our hands together and blew into them before heading through the main hall, turning right and back outside to the open-air bus station of the town. I had been here once before, way back 6 months prior, and damn, it hadn't been this cold. I put my gloves straight back on and kept rubbing them together. The area was completely empty but us, the wide open stone space on all sides of us, and a bus ahead. The first main buildings were easily 100 meters to our left, whilst the tube platform and all the snow were piled up to our right. We looked around ourselves and realized that there were only a few others who had gotten off the tube with us. They walked ahead of us, making us the last in the queue. We continued over to the bus, which didn't have any sign, and we just assumed it was for us. Jackson led the group, and we jumped up and down to get the blood circulating as the chill wind ripped right through us. Jackson walked up to the driver. Är den här bussen för Uppsala? Nej, nästa, the bus driver replied. Ja? Ja. Jackson was still standing inside the bus door, looking back at us with his brows furrowed. He stood there awkwardly, processing the information for a few seconds. He realized that his presence on the bus was becoming more hostile, with him keeping the door open. The inside of the bus was very dark and quiet, and it was impossible to get to any other members of the bus to ask them where they were headed. There didn't seem to be any explanation for all of this. "Är du säker?" Jackson asked one more time. With a little bit more mumbling between Jackson and the driver, nothing seemed positive, to be organized, to be resolved. Tom, Axel, and I stood by the bus door and watched Jackson come off dejectedly. "Next one," he told us. "Are you sure?" we asked. "No." So we righted our bags and rubbed our hands together and got off the courtyard platform into the bus stop a few meters away. With the snow falling, we didn't get any respite from the cold, but at least we got a little bit of shelter. As the bus drove away, Jackson told us all, "The man said the next bus will take us to Uppsala." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Seems rather fishy." Axel and Tom murmured their agreement, and we chatted for a while about when we were finally, if ever, getting home. It was so cold. That's all I can remember as I write this now. Västerås was cold and open and empty, and it was late and cold, and there was nothing more we wanted than our own warm beds, with hopefully an angryless, nakedless, Germanless shower first. Axel suggested that we go back into the tube station and wait there until it was warmer. We got up from the bus stop and seats and walked there. Halfway across, the cleaners on the inside slammed the door shut, preempting our return. The lady in front of us turned off the main lights of the station, only leaving the emergency exit lights on. The station was close to us, and we were alone. A strange sound of a buzzsaw came from the main building across the road from us. I remember that it used to be an old textile factory, but I couldn't imagine that anyone was working there right now at almost midnight on a Sunday night. I had already had enough of this town, and we'd only been hanging around for 15 minutes. We returned back to the bus stop and hid under the shelter as the snow came down and down and down. Time passed, and nothing happened. Time passed, and nothing ever happened. Time passed, and it was so damn cold. We started to come to a dark realization. We were alone in Västerås, and the bus was not going to come. Why, oh why had we not pushed onto the bus, we asked each other. There was no choice. We hadn't been allowed. It wasn't our bus. The next bus will come. The next bus will never come. There is no next bus. Don't worry. Just wait a little longer. And we waited. By now it was coming midnight, and we had stood and paced around our tiny bus shelter for a long time now. We realized eventually that we weren't going home that night. There were now two options open to us. We had to sleep somewhere. We could neither sleep inside or outside. The big problem, as it had been when we shopped together and did the usual banal things, was that it was hard to organize these things. I was particularly bad for this, as I didn't want to spend any more than I had, which was not much. Honestly, I was feeling like Kerouac. Why not sleep outside? I asked myself the question legitimately. Why not sleep outside? I had never done it before. We could become the first homeless people in Sweden. I was crazy back then. Not that I deserved sympathy. I was so cheap that I genuinely considered sleeping outside rather than spending money on a place to stay for the night. Tom was somewhat of the same opinion, but thankfully for our sakes, Jaxel took over the group. They demanded that we find a place to stay and sleep. And so we walked, past the textile factory where the sound of the buzzsaw followed us. With the big tall factory buildings and great open distances between them, the buzz echoed off the walls and changed tone and volume. The sound was all around us. Jackson convinced us that it was probably safer sleeping inside instead of outside with the buzzsaw people. I was inclined to agree, and so we quickened our pace, warmed our hearts, and headed for bed. On his phone, Jackson had found a place or two on the map. One was right near us, and we found the door after 5 minutes. Axel, the Swede, led us to confirm that there would be no miscommunication. The door was locked, and we had had to do some mad waving to get the man who was sitting at the faraway desk on the other side of the room to see us. Being midnight, the hostel was at best Västerås and safe and secure in the evenings. The man looked up from his desk and saw us. Coming to the door, he opened it and asked us what we wanted. Axel informed the dude of our situation. He wasn't all that sympathetic or persuaded by the fact that we wanted to stay the night. He informed Axel of the prices, and Axel translated the hard news to us. We'll have to take 2 rooms, so in total it'll be something like 3,000 money units for the night. We were taken aback at the amount it would cost, especially myself. In Sweden, I was living off a lump sum of money, and everything that ate away at it would lead me to the magical number 0. We had to think between us. Tom suggested that, what with the other places being around, there might be cheaper places. The man understood, closed, and locked the door in front of us, and we continued to head onward. And a cheaper place we did find. It turned out, after walking for 10 seconds, we discovered that Västerås had its own personal NORAD. We went up to the door and found that they were closing down. Like at the tube station, young men and women our age swept and swooped the togas off the floor and into the compactor. It was past midnight now, and the shop had finally closed, the last bastion of our defense. As was the case everywhere in this part of the world, the city went to sleep around 5 p.m. and everything closed down. Only NORAD would have been able to save us, and in spite of their promise to stay open until 4 a.m., they had brutused us in the back. Standing in the shelter of NORAD, Jackson got out his phone again to check our other options. Our second hostel was not too far down the road, but seemed to be even harder to penetrate. Inconspicuous, the entrance was very small and thin, and the sign above the door did not give an obvious implication that there was anything commercial behind. Once again, we squeezed up to the door to try and find a way in, but all we could see were a few happy plants basking in the indoor warmth and presumably pleasing the sleeping customers. There was no bell and no form of entering of any kind to bar the passcode keypad on the left wall. None of us knowing the passcode and none of us being brave enough to take a guess, or bang on the door loudly enough to get the innards to be able to hear us, we gave up, defeated. Jackson suggested a third hostel, but it was more than 10 minutes' walk away toward the old town of Västerås. We had a chit-chat, but the mood was obvious. Accepting our final defeat, we straightened up and returned to Västerås. The same gentleman awaited us, seated at his night desk, looking down presumably at his phone. He was yawning when Axel tapped on the front door window, so he straightened himself up and came to our aid. Axel once again led, explaining our situation, our lack of funds, our desperation to get away from the cold and the terrifying sound of the late-night factory buzzsaw. We could still hear the echoes as the porter led us inside. Standing in the warmth, finally, we looked around us. Shaking our jackets, the snow fell onto a nice dark carpet that our shoes muddied. A few comfortable chairs lay around, whilst the high window there were some plants lying around in this hostel too. Asking regarding price and place and everything complicated, Axel and Jackson chatted in Swedish with the porter. Upon finding out we were from Saucetown, the porter smiled, telling us that he was a native Saucetownie himself. He immediately took pity on us and gave us a deal. 1 room, 2 beds, extra dunnas, 2 people in the beds, 2 people on the floor. Done. Free of charge. It was as good as we could ever hope to get. Thompson got the 2 beds, which was perfectly fair. After a few minutes, the porter came back, bringing with him 2 duvets and 2 pillows, all together in one big pile in his arms. He placed them down on the bed, and now with an air of seriousness, he asked us to keep the noise down, not to tell anyone or bring attention to ourselves about how we were staying, the usual expected stuff. He gave us a lasting smile as he closed the door behind himself. That was the last time we ever saw him, and I still think about him every day. Approximately 2 seconds after the porter shut the door, I turned around to find Tom opening up a can of beer. He started to huck, Slav squatting down on the ground and taking an initial swig of booze and grinning through a frothy mouth of beer. He hucked again, and we were right back in business. The moment of serenity and calm was over. All 5 minutes of it were very special to us. We packed away our things regardless of our tiredness. There wasn't much left to do now that we were safe, other than to wait until the morning and get the next bus home. I laid my blankets on the floor, whilst my own backpack, full to the brim with clothes and my other stuff, was propped up inside the small room cupboard. The others, like Tom and Jackson, just jumped on their respective beds to get some quick rest lying down. Axel, like me, was going to have to sleep on the floor, so he carefully put his dunna into a molded shape that would envelop him like a cocoon when the time was right. Devices took over, and we stared at some screens for a few minutes. Then there was a knock at the door. I stood up and opened it. What could it be? I thought. We had made no noise. But of course, it was the porter having returned to us once again. All 4 of us cheered as fans do at a goal in the World Cup of Raceball, and the porter wheeshed his finger up to his mouth and ordered our noise to cease. In his other hand was a big flat tray, and on the tray was 4 cups of hot, delicious Saucetown schlum, the perfect treat for sleepy boys. I hope you're all staying quiet in here, the porter told us in a teacherly voice. Yes, Mr. Porter, we replied in unison. Please, call me Père, he replied. He sat down at the foot of Jackson's bed, looking at us all with lovingly father eyes. To each of us he passed a delicious hot cup of schlum, telling us, careful, not to burn your lips, it's fresh from the kettle. It must be F250. This pleasant surprise having worn off, we grew comfortable with Porter Père's presence. We started to ask him things, foremostly why he was being so nice to us. You see, he explained, this is hardly the first time Saucetownies, or those who look like Saucetownies, have been dumped at Swedish satellite towns to fend for themselves. What, did you think that you were the only ones? This has been going on almost as long as Saucetown broke free from the Swedish shackles. It's a game they like to play. They don't see us as human, you or I. But we're not Saucetownies, Jackson protested. Of course you're not. But what do you think a country Chinese tube conductor will do when they see people like you? Think, you're on the Saucetown tube direct to the capital of Sweden, where they assume you will just loiter and fill up the streets with more Saucetown slime. Look at you, grubby clothes, unshaven, speaking in a dialect that's barely any language. Hell, I would dump you at Söderhamn right now if I could. The first thing I want to do when I look at you is to abandon you at small tube stations. We were all taken aback, and not without being quite hurt at Porter Pear's comments. Don't misunderstand me, he continued. I was once like yourself. I was young, even younger than you, perhaps. I was in my final year at high school when the same thing happened to me. On a history trip to Saucetown, we had all stayed the weekend and learned of the great nation's background and its culture. Myself being a native Saucetownie, I was the celebrity of my classroom for a few days, telling everyone funny stories and anecdotes about the town. My teachers loved me and my classmates loved me. I can't remember ever enjoying school that much when I was younger. Then came the journey back. I was young, remember, so don't judge me for my actions. I had no idea of the external geopolitical situation regarding Saucetownies at the time. You have to remember that in the late 80s, the Berlin Wall fell down. We got to the border and I handed in my passport. Suddenly, my gift was a curse. The only native Saucetownie of the class, I was taken to one side and given a talking down in country Chinese. I didn't understand what they were saying, and I wasn't able to get my teacher to help. Hell, my teacher would have understood the country Chinese worse than I did. They informed me in their best Bagelton that I would have to get off the tube at Västerås and make an appointment at the migration official there. I assured them that I had all the papers that they would require at my home in Sky City, and that there was no such way a border migration office would be open close to midnight local time in Västerås. They didn't listen to my protests and merely repeated the instructions to me and went onward through the tube. From then on, I was a pariah. My classmates wouldn't speak to me out of resentment or fear, one of the two. My teacher refused to help me sort out this migration mess, saying it was out of his jurisdiction as a Swedish teacher, whatever that meant. What it did mean in reality was that, when we got to Västerås, I had been sitting all alone with none of my classmates around me. 2 other guards on the same tube came to get me, and almost manhandled me off the tube and onto the Västerås platform. Of course, there never even was a migratory office in Västerås. It was all just a mean trick. I had been thrown off the tube and into the cold, empty street of Västerås. No friends, no family here, just cold and alone. How long ago was this? Oh, it's been so many years I don't remember, he sighed, then took a long, slow breath. He continued, Next thing I know, I'm just a crazed kid, hungry and cold, wandering through this empty town, desperate for a place to stay. Everything was shut, and nobody would let me in. There weren't any fast NORADs in those days where you could just lay a bag down and get a few hours rest. There was nothing, and I think I could have died there and then, that night. What happened? Jackson asked. I saw a light. But it wasn't a light, it was a man. His name was Eskil. He came to me in the night, gave me his hand, and took me with him to his hostel, this place. At the time, Västerås was just a small place with a few rooms, but Eskil was a Saucetownie himself, and he knew what the situation was like for the natives who got thrown off tubes. I don't know what he was doing out at the time of night on that particular Sunday, but there he was, and now I'm here. He saved my life that night, gave me a place to sleep and food to eat, and after a couple of days recovering in bed, I was employed to work for him. I've been here ever since. You've never gone back to Sky City or Saucetown? Never. Why, it's only an hour on the road. No need. I was about to follow up with a why, but he saw it and he stopped me with a wave of a hand. That's enough for one night. After you're done, just place the schlum back on the tray, and the maid will clean it up after you're gone. Don't make too much noise, and stay safe, fellow travelers. He stood up off Jackson's bed, glided without any upper body movement to the door, and closed it with a tiny click behind him. Geez, oh man, Tom said. This is just nuts, I responded. Do you guys want to watch some TV? Jackson asked. Sure, said Axel. There was very little on the TV except for one movie, California with a K. We would have to give it a shot. Regardless, all throughout the movie we were silent, thinking about what Per Porter had said to us. We wondered if he really was Standolphus. We wondered if anything he had said was true. We drank our schlum, brushed our teeth, and took the remaining hours of the night as well-earned sleeping time. We would have to be up relatively early to get past the questioning staff members, so we wasted no time resting, even if for Axel and I it meant to lie down on the floor. Well, I had slept on worse.
Chapter 11. Dawn of the final day. 24 hours remain. For once, we didn't stress upon waking. It must have just been after 10 a.m. while the breakfast was still open. We got up quick as we could get there. I had personally woken up with Axel's feet in my face and had to get my bearings after a subpar number of hours under the snooze. Thompson had both been snoring after peeing really loudly. I gave the others a brilliant alarm clock to wake by. Someone checked the time and remembered that the breakfast bar was closing 10:30 a.m. Stuff had never left its bags, so we clambered everything together, threw the donnas on the bed, and got the hell out of there while we still could. Going in pairs of twos, we traveled to the ground floor and into the breakfast room. Plenty of space, and we sat not too far from the entrance at a 4-person table together. Once again, in twos, we stood up to get our breakfast. It was late Monday morning in early March, so the fact that our 2 other tables were occupied was not a surprise. Hunger got the best of us, and I impatiently stood up with Tom to go get our food after a minute's wait. It was good to get proper korv again. Back in Saucetown, even the solids were liquid. The Caesars and Bagelton were delicious, but more artisanal and less in keeping with my breakfast diet. For once I didn't want a delicacy, but something simple and ready to eat. Grabbed a korv, some cereal, and my favorite, pear water on tap. There was even a fizzy pear water, but I wasn't feeling brave enough that morning to rot out my teeth with fizzy pear water. We were by the window, southeastern facing. I sat across from Axel, both of us by the window. We ate in silence, and after we were done we remained silent. Some red curtains made a comfortable barrier between us and the hotel walls. The sun was shining in on us, and all 4 of us sat with our heads in our hands, just contemplating. I looked out the window at the distant high-rise across from us I had not seen the prior night. How good it was to wake in best Västerås with some warmth and fresh food. When we had been back in the room together, Tom had tested out the floor as the rest of us had got ready. Lying on his stomach, he stared at his phone for a full 10 minutes without other movement. The bucking was ceasing. His energy was low. Neither he nor the rest of us had showered. Jaxel hadn't even showered, probably since Friday morning, since the angry naked German incident. I was increasingly able to smell myself, and it surprised me less that they dumped us here in Västerås rather than polluting Sky City. In thought, I hadn't realized this, but our breakfast had been huge. Sitting now with empty plates, we had each consumed mountains of korv and herring. We were appropriately sobered up for our final journey home. Jackson, our de facto leader, once again checked his phone and discovered that buses left for Uppsala once every hour. The next one was leaving in 20 minutes. So it was to be. We had placed our food trays in the one provided by the hotel staff. We straightened up and confidently headed out of the hostel in a pair of twos. But Thompson were stopped. The receptionist reminded them to pay for the rooms. Handing their keys back to the front desk, Thompson stood around, shuffling nervously as the receptionist looked through his computer. Time passed. Axel and myself pretended badly to separate clients, and we sat in the comfy armchairs by the door because we couldn't stand the cold outside air. "Why, sirs," we could hear the receptionist say to Thompson's, "you have already paid. How strange." "Yes, we paid yesterday evening with Per, the evening porter." The receptionist looked up from the computer at 2 of them and beamed a big smile. "Oh, Porter Per. Well, say no more. Safe travels." He shook Thompson's hand and bade them farewell. Saucetownies made friends in high places, it seemed. Our 2 friends came to us, and together we braced the cold wind of Västerås one more time. It was more beautiful in the morning, we gave it that. The whole town seemed half the size in daylight. The buzzer noise had stopped at some point, and even from the hostel we could see the straight line of direction we would need to take to get to the tube station. Why, it was only 5 minutes away. So off we went. At the station it was relatively quiet, as we expected it to be. We didn't want to risk chatting to the staff and so we found our way to the automatic tiki machines. This time Axel and I copped up the dosh to pay for our bus tickets, and lo and behold, the bus was already waiting at the station. No time to waste, off we went. All this movement and excitement was adding to the physical buzz we were feeling inside all of us. It was as if our speed and direction were one within our minds and as outside our bodies. We're outside of ourselves, observing the inevitable return home and our spirits to their final resting place. The bus sat exactly where last night's bus had been, the one that had not led us on the night prior. We gulped. I offered to get on first. I was about to say something to the driver, then thought, no. I wouldn't say anything that would give us away. We were all tired of being treated like sauce criminals. In fact, I led us all to the upper deck of the bus just so we could be out of eye and earshot of the driver. Sat by Tom with Jaxel on our same row, but on the left side of the bus. I got the window seat as my preference every time, while Tom and I started working out between us the direct calculation of Fantigrade to Celsius and Fahrenheit. Jackson fell asleep almost immediately. Axel looked at his phone and caught up with a weekend of missed messages and emergency phone calls. The journey was to take around 90 minutes, so we had some time to think things through and get our bearings. But it didn't happen like that. This time went by at breakneck speed. We had no time to think. The only one of us who actually did anything was Jackson, and he slept through the whole trip. Next thing we know, we're in Uppsala. Far too soon. What an anticlimax. But there we were. On our distant horizon on our right, Tom and I could see the grand obelisk of a.k.a. to welcome us home. Blue and yellow, the giant Lego brick gazed at us with authority. Above all else in this flat country, it was our beacon of our tyrannical home. Uppland's country is mostly flat, like Belgium, except with fewer cows and more trees. It was easy, especially coming in from the south as we were, to see almost every landmark that Uppsala had to offer from a distance of many kilometers. After a.k.a. came the big boulevard, visible to us on the bus, and its destination of the twin-spired cathedral at the second highest point of the town. The only higher point of land held Slotten, though in height the cathedral surpassed it. Not really believing we were home, we never vocalized our return. We experienced it, and we sat in our seats, feeling the sweat of the indoors cling to us and add to the thick layer of greasiness that had followed us all the way back from Saucetown. I felt guilty or resentful. I couldn't work it out. There was a sense of betrayal against the high voices in the universe. Why, oh why me? They cried out. Why must I return home to this wasteland of reality? Why, oh why do my dreams not reflect my reality? I felt cheated that my madness had been so short. My madness felt more pleasurable and desirable to me than the real thing. I resented the loss of my lack of responsibility that I had felt for days. I resented the resuming of my day-to-day life as if nothing had ever happened. The bus was traveling up the boulevard and into the main city of Uppsala. The ending was almost upon us. And then, quick as that it was, the four of us, Axel, Tom, Jackson, and I, got off the bus somewhere a few stops before the terminus at the main bus station. We didn't need to go that far. With our packs on our bags, tired out, we stepped off and regrouped outside, not long before lunchtime, barely awake and barely alive. Geez, oh man, Tom said. Gotta get home, to shower and change, Jackson cried out in desperation. We all agreed and chuckled together. There were a few long pauses. I spoke up. Honestly, I don't want to go home just yet. After all of this, I can't just go home and shower. I need some time to process what had happened. The other three agreed. Should we get some fika? Axel asked. Absolutely, Jackson cried out in yet more desperation. We were standing on Kungsgatan, so we only had a few corners and a few minutes to get anywhere. We had a few regular places, and we knew that Hugo's cafe was always open. Rummet Storken was closer, but Hugo's was the best. So it was. We turned around on Kungsgatan, walked a minute, made a left on St. Olofsgatan, and crossed the main road at the Skeleton Cross, past Alejandro's cafe, past the Russian tourist office, plus the other sex shop, a right turn around the English bookshop and onto Svartbäcksgatan, where a few places down on the right lay Hugo's. The door opened with a dingly-dang-dong. A lady was there to serve us, but neither Hugo nor his father were around. We each got our respective drinks. Coffee, 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 and tea. The usual. They left my strainer in the cup so long that the contents of the mug were black no matter how much milk they put in. No matter, I needed the caffeine after what I had been through. There were always seats at the back, because the place looked really weird at the back and there were no windows. The table we had used to make our initial GRUNK night plan was now uncomfortably taken, but there remained plenty of spots to take advantage of. We took a corner table for the four of us. Jackson and Tom had most stuff, and they threw it down on the seats next to them. There was just enough space for Axel to sit down on the comfy stuff by the wall. He offered it to me, but I politely refused, and upon taking one of the few chairs that there ever were to spare, sat on the outside edge of the table by the other customers and relaxed. We all sat in silence for a little while. It was the last silence, really, because after a quick joke and a silly little anecdote, the mood returned. The mood was unquenchable, its resource impossible to drain. We seemed to be endlessly able to accommodate what life brought us, or indeed what we brought ourselves in this life. As they slipped their cap of coffee and chatted, it was me who brought down the mood in my absence, in my silence. I turned inward and cut myself off from it all. Jackson, who sat to my left, would end up leaving Uppsala like the rest of us did in June of that year. Without any desire to do so, he had to go home to his native Ohio and finish off his degree. It was the dumb thing and the smartest thing to do. When he returned home, he did his absolute utmost to come back to Sweden and live life the way he wanted it. He ended up finding a master's in London, whatever got him nearby. After he found the master's wasn't really what he wanted, he found love through travels to Uppsala with a mutual friend we all know. From there, he migrated. He found work in another company, and after a few years out, he found his way back home and back to happiness. Tom, who sat across me, left that summer too. He had become increasingly alienated with his lot in life in America, and after getting through his degree, he left Northern California and moved to Portland. All our conversations went back to Uppsala, to those days. I don't think he ever managed to get back home, but he still did what he could to survive and to find that happiness again. Axel was a Uppsala native. A few years later, he called our time together lightning in a bottle, and he continued the student life there without us. I like to think life never reached those lofty heights again for him, but I really hope it did. Eventually, he became the first curator of Kalmar Student Union and continued studying for a very long time. Kept in touch with him the least, but I owe him as much as the rest. It was for his honesty and his willingness to differ. Of all the Uppsala folk who remained, he was the one who kept in touch and supported me when I was a refugee far from home. One by one, they all disappeared from the table, each with their own reasons and their own life stories that began before me, and would continue after I was gone. I felt I could almost see the lines on the map that had been drawn at this point in history to this very place in the world, with me before their lines would again disappear off the grid somewhere else. Jackson spoke above the din. "Did I ever tell you of the story of when I saw Groundhog Day?" We shook our heads. "Oh, this one's a doozy."